For years, Beatrice Ingram had struggled to find her place in the world.
She was someone that, put it mildly, made some poor choices.
But then she married a cab driver named Terry Camper.
Beatrice loved Terry. He was good to her.
They enjoyed each other's company. They worked together all the time.
They spent 10 happy years together. But in 2012, their marriage would suddenly, tragically end.
There's a dead man on the street.
I opened the car door to check for vital signs. My hand was full of blood.
He had been shot twice in the back of the head.
The beloved cab driver's murder came as a shock to the entire community.
Why would you want to shoot him? You know, why would anybody do that?
Was it a robbery?
Someone who has a substance abuse problem, they're just trying to, score some cash real quick.
Or did Beatrice have a dark secret in her past?
Detectives recovered a box that contained hundreds of letters.
Would the letters lead police to the killer?
John Murray was a convicted murderer.
He was adamant that he was being railroaded.
Or was that all part of Beatrice's plan?
His mother says, "That bitch killed my son."
Peekskill, New York, October 3rd, 2012. Nestled on the banks of the Hudson River, this picturesque town of 25,000 is conveniently close to Manhattan.
It's about a 45-minute commute from New York City. More of a suburban type area. A lot of families there. A lot of people commute back forth to the city.
But Peekskill retains all its quaint, small-town charm.
It's one of those kinds of towns where you may not know everybody by name, but you certainly know everybody by face.
Which is why the 911 call that came in just after 2 that afternoon from a mail carrier on Pine Street was such an incredible shock.
Peekskill 911 emergency. There's a dead man on the street. On Pine Street? Yeah, he's in his car. He looks like he probably had a heart attack.
Police and EMTs rushed to Pine Street, and Officer Liz Fulch was the first to arrive.
I approached the vehicle, and I realized that there was the taxi driver that I knew as Terry slumped over to the right side.
53-year-old Terry Camper had been driving a cab in Peekskill for almost 30 years.
Terry was well known in the community, very popular, just one of those guys that always had a smile on his face.
The guy that will wave at you every morning, that you will see at the local deli, that you will grab a cup of coffee, say hello, how's the family?
But was the friendly, easygoing cab driver actually dead? Despite what the 911 call reported, Officer Fulch hoped that wasn't the case.
I called, sir, are you okay? And he didn't respond.
And when Officer Fulch opened the door of the cab to check Terry's vital signs, she found out why he wasn't responding. And contrary to what the 911 call said, it wasn't a heart attack.
I touched blood on the left side of his neck. My hand was full of blood. That's when I realized that it was something more.
He had been shot twice in the back of the head.
And yet, despite the grave nature of Terry's injuries, the original report of a dead man on the street was incorrect.
EMS arrived on the scene shortly after I did. With their equipment, they were able to detect some signs of life.
And with Terry clinging desperately to life, the EMTs fought to save him.
They just removed him out of the vehicle and started performing CPR, attempting to resuscitate him. It was pretty intense.
And within minutes, they'd hustled Terry into the back of the ambulance and raced off to the emergency room.
I was just like, oh my God, he has a family, he has a wife. I really hope that this guy makes it through.
With Terry's fate still uncertain as the ambulance raced away, the police made an urgent call to his wife, 60-year-old Beatrice Camper, to break the horrifying news that her husband of 10 years was fighting for his life. Born in 1952, Beatrice Ingram started life an hour downriver from Peekskill.
She lived in Queens when she was younger.
And it was there that teenage Beatrice fell for a neighborhood boy named John.
They, developed a friendship.
Eventually, John and Beatrice became an item.
Beatrice very much was in love with John.
But Beatrice had fallen for a bad boy.
He had gotten in a lot of trouble. He'd been involved in drugs.
And her teenage romance soon led her down a dangerous path.
She started out with pills, and from pills,
She went to the hard stuff, which was cocaine.
She was someone that, put it mildly, made some poor choices.
John's choices soon landed him behind bars, though. Heartbroken by her boyfriend's incarceration, Beatrice did her best to start over. And by her 20s, she'd met someone new and appeared to be on a better path.
She was married. She got 2 girls and a boy.
But that relationship eventually ended. And once her kids were grown, Beatrice struggled with what to do for the next chapter of her life. A search that would lead her to Peekskill, New York, and Terry Camper. 7 years younger than Beatrice, Terry's life also started south of Peekskill, 1,200 miles south.
We all are from Hattiesburg, Mississippi.
But when Terry was only 5, the family moved north after their father took a job near Peekskill.
Daddy worked at the Veterans Hospital, which is in Montrose, New York, until he was 79, and then he retired.
And as a result, Peekskill was the only home that Terry ever really knew.
He really wouldn't have remembered anything about Mississippi. He was 5 years old.
Growing up in Peekskill, Terry thrived in his new environment.
He always had a lot of friends, even at a young age. He'd have friends coming around to the house, and he'd be there all the time.
Terry was easygoing, lovable, playful, and outgoing.
And not long after graduating high school in 1978, he launched a career that fit with his easygoing, gregarious nature.
He started his own taxi company. That's all he wanted to do. It was nothing else he wanted to do but drive the taxi.
It meant everything to him. He loved to be out in the public.
And by the end of the 90s, Terry had built a successful business.
Lawyers, doctors, everybody wanted him to take him to the airport or wherever.
The lovable cabbie had also become a fixture in his hometown.
He's a guy that the community knew. Nice guy. He'd always wave hello if you saw you, driving around Peekskill. He'd always throw you a wave.
Terry talked to everybody, the police, the mayor, you name it, anybody. He never met a stranger.
However, at the age of 40, Terry had yet to meet someone special.
He always called himself a lady man, but I just never known him to be like that, just from lady to lady to lady.
Ladies' man or not, Terry was about to become seriously involved.
He met Beatrice at the train station. He picked her up, taking her back home to, which is in White Plains.
And as the friendly cab driver talked to her, he learned that Beatrice was trying to turn her life around after a long struggle with drug addiction.
She'd been through detox, and she was in the wire because she needed somewhere in the station, had nowhere to stay, and she has to go through that program.
After that meeting, then he got her number or where she lived, and he would pick her up from time to time, and then he brought her up to meet the family.
And it was clear that Beatrice was becoming more than just a regular fare.
He talked to me. He said, I like her. I like her a lot.
And when Beatrice completed her program, Terry convinced his family to help.
When she came out the wire, she had nowhere to go. My mother took her in. She stayed with my mother a good 8-9 months.
So they got closer and closer, and they just started dating.
Beatrice's recovery had given her a new lease on life, and Terry was clearly a big part of that.
They really liked each other. I was like, okay, this'll work. They enjoyed each other's company.
The couple eventually got an apartment together, and after a year of dating, Terry asked Beatrice to marry him.
Terry loved her dearly. He did a lot for her and her family.
Beatrice said yes. After all, he had rescued her when she needed it most.
Beatrice loved Terry because he was good to her.
And in 2002, they were married.
It was a beautiful wedding. Yeah, because my brother and I and the rest of us, we did all the cooking for the wedding.
And marrying Beatrice made Terry an instant grandparent, since her children were grown with children of their own.
Her grandkids, every one of them loved him. Every one of them, because her daughter kids was in the car with him all the time. He'd bring them over to my house.
He loved them little kids like they were his own.
And over the next few years, the couple settled into a modest but comfortable life together.
She was working at Walmart. He was really doing good at that point. He had other people running for him, so his money was coming in, and he was able to take care of his taxi business.
Terry still loved to drive, though. He drove his cab regularly, and Beatrice was often at his side.
Beatrice used to ride with Terry everywhere on his runs.
Except when she was away visiting her daughter for the weekend, or at work.
He would take her to work, and then after they get off from work, they ride around. They were together all the time.
However, Beatrice wouldn't be along for what turned out to be Terry's last ride. Coming up, was Terry's final passenger a killer?
Man says, I need a ride from Pine Street.
And if so, where was he now?
We were able to track that phone.
It was a little after 2 on the afternoon of October 3rd, 2012, when the police in picturesque Peekskill, New York, received a surprising 911 call.
There's a dead man on the street. On Pine Street? Yeah, he's in his car.
And when officers arrived on Pine Street a few minutes later, they were shocked to find 53-year-old Terry Camper slumped behind the wheel of his taxi cab. The beloved cabbie had been shot twice in the back of the head.
I knew Mr. Camper as a local taxi driver. I traveled with Mr. Camper into the ambulance, into the hospital. The EMS guys were working very hard. Immediately upon his arrival to the hospital, they continued life-saving measures. They continued to perform CPR.
And while the doctors did everything they could, Terry's wife of 10 years, 60-year-old Beatrice Camper, rushed to his side.
His wife has shown up within what appeared to me minutes of our arrival at the hospital.
Unfortunately, Beatrice was already too late.
At 3:05, they pronounced him dead. She was crying. She was visibly upset.
I met B in the hallway, and B hugged me. He's gone. And I said, okay, he's gone. I said, what happened?
But Beatrice said she didn't know, because while the doctors told her and the family that Terry was dead, it was the police who told them how Terry died.
He told her he had been shot in the back of the head. They don't know who did it, but he had been shot in the back of the head twice.
We're saying, shot. Why would someone want to shoot him?
It was just too shocking. He didn't bother nobody. He didn't do anything to anyone.
The most logical assumption, based on what police knew so far, was a robbery.
I always tell him, I says, Lizard, stop showing your money, because he would always tell me like he was showing a few dollars. I said, put your money away.
When you have a taxi driver known to carry cash, it would be the direction any investigator would probably begin to go in.
So hoping to piece together Terry's last hours, the investigators turned to the friends and family gathered in the waiting room.
The family at the hospital was understandably very distraught, upset, emotional, but at the same time they were very helpful. We needed to find out who he was last with. That's going to give us the information that we need.
And it just so happened that one of Terry's friends had an important clue to share. A friend of Terry's named Ruth, she often rode along with him for company.
He always liked somebody else to be there. So Ruth would ride because she didn't have a job at the time.
Ruth told the investigators that she'd been riding with Terry earlier that afternoon. And shortly before he dropped her off, Terry had gotten a call.
She said she picked up the phone. Ruth would answer the phone all the time in the car. And the man says, I need a ride from Pine Street.
Did the fact that the caller wanted to be picked up on the street where Terry had been shot mean he was the killer? Back at the crime scene, there was nothing inside the cab to identify Terry's final fare, though police did find some key evidence.
There were 2 shell casings in the car and a live round left in the backseat of the car.
We were looking for a .22 caliber handgun as the murder weapon.
And in addition to the shell casings in the back seat, the investigators at the scene also found Terry's empty wallet.
A crime with someone who has a substance abuse problem, something along those lines where they're not thinking correctly and they're just trying to, score some cash real quick. That was our first impression of what might have happened.
And if the killer was an addict looking for some quick cash, it looked like they'd made a critical error.
Terry's cell phone was not in the cab, and that was not on his person.
Had the killer taken it? The investigators hoped that was the case.
Smartphones put off a GPS locator, and you can ping it and find out where it is.
And contacted the phone carrier. We were able to track that phone.
We found that the cell phone was not in Peekskill.
It was across the Hudson near West Point.
We had a general area of where the phone was.
It was somewhere along a wooded stretch of highway, not far from the river.
At that point, we just had a detective constantly calling the phone, and we basically just walked through the woods and the side of the road until actually detective did actually hear the phone ringing.
It was located on the side of a road, as if it had been thrown out of a window of a moving car.
The cell phone trace hadn't led the police directly to Terry's killer, but it did provide a crucial clue.
Once we find the cell phone, we know that somebody took it from him and that they fled north, that they went at least from Peekskill up into Orange County, at least as far as the cell phone went. And in order for someone to do that, they would have to cross the Bear Mountain Bridge, just based on where the telephone was located. And that was important because we knew that the Bear Mountain Bridge had video surveillance cameras on it and recorded every vehicle that went over it.
The question was, whose car were they looking for? Could the call log of Terry's phone provide an answer?
Police immediately tried to figure out who the last phone call was made from. And what happened is they were able to trace that call to a burner phone.
But since it was a prepaid or burner phone, it appeared that investigators had reached a dead end.
That's basically a phone you buy, and you put minutes on it. There wasn't a name associated that we could track down.
Desperate, the investigators contacted the burner phone's provider. And while they had no way to identify who had purchased the phone, they could provide police with a list of calls made by the burner. And when the detectives reviewed it, they realized that in addition to Terry, the owner of the burner phone had also called a woman named Sandra Dolman.
They rang my bell. The Peekskill police, state police, and a state trooper. So I asked, what was the problem? Did I get any calls or did I make any calls?
They showed her the number, which she immediately identified as being her friend, John Murray.
And then when I was down at the police station, they asked me, how did I know Mr. Murray? I told them that I met John Murray through an associate of mine who was a resident of Sing Sing.
In other words, an inmate of New York's maximum security state prison.
John Murray, we found after running a criminal history on him to be someone who had recently served time for 2 murders.
He had gotten out in November of 2011. He was still on parole.
And for the past 11 months, he'd been living with his wife.
She was a minister. She came to visit him on a ministry, and she married him in prison.
However, what stood out to the investigators was the fact that John and his wife lived in the town of Newburgh, across the Hudson from Peekskill.
You know, obviously, to go back to Newburgh, you can take that same route of travel over the bridge.
And when the investigators reviewed the surveillance footage from the bridge, it looked as if everything was finally falling into place.
We were able to observe the vehicle, which we believe to be John Murray's. It crossed the Bear Mountain Bridge at approximately 1 p.m., heading east toward Peekskill. And then we had that same vehicle coming back across the bridge toward Newburgh at approximately 2 p.m.
It's hard not to say that there was a connection there when you see John Murray's vehicle essentially cross over the bridge right when the murder takes place and then leave the bridge shortly after the murder takes place.
But what was the connection between John and Terry? Why would he want the cab driver dead?
I mean, he was the kind of guy you wouldn't think had an enemy in the world.
Less than 10 hours after the shooting, the Peekskill police were in Newburgh looking for some answers.
A little after midnight, we knocked on the door of Mr. Murray's residence. They wasn't happy to see us.
Although the ex-con did cooperate.
John agrees to go to the City Newburgh Police Department. At that point, he's interviewed by 2 of our detectives.
Though as soon as John sat down with the detectives, they realized the ex-con would be tough to crack.
He had a 1,000-yard stare when you talked to him. He looked right through you. He gave off this aura of just someone who was very cold and dark.
They asked where he was that day. He stated he was, in the city of Newburgh with his wife. Basically gives nothing that he was in Peekskill.
The investigators knew it was a lie.
They had very clear footage of the car, of its license plate, of a person who fits the description of John Murray.
But then they started to press John, asking questions about his cell phone number.
At that point, he stops talking with the detective. He just stopped answering any other questions, and he wanted to leave.
It certainly looked suspicious, especially when coupled with the evidence that the police already had. They knew that John Murray was a convicted killer. They knew he'd placed a call to Terry shortly before the murder, and they could put him traveling to and from the scene of the crime.
You're starting to really get pieces coming together. and you're starting to realize that you have a very strong suspect.
However, despite all the circumstantial evidence pointing to John, the police still couldn't quite prove that he had killed Terry.
So at that point, he was free to go.
Because while they suspected he had killed the cabbie, the investigators still had no idea why John would want Terry dead. Coming up, the investigators uncover some surprising evidence.
There was hundreds of phone calls, hundreds.
And the phone calls lead to a new suspect.
He was sending her love letters almost daily.
By the morning of October 4th, 2012, it had been less than 25 hours since Beatrice Camper's husband, Terry, had been murdered while driving his cab in Peekskill, New York. But the investigators already had a suspect, John Murray.
We've pretty much put him in the area of the crime. We've put him along the path where the cell phone was recovered. We've got something going on here.
And most suspicious of all, John had recently been released from prison.
Red flags went up when they realized that John Murray was a convicted murderer.
However, despite all the clues pointing to John as the killer, one big question remained.
What's the relationship with Terry Camper and John Murray? They seem like two guys on two different sides of the tracks.
Why would you want to shoot him? It just could not register in my mind. Why? Why would anybody do that?
So hoping to uncover just how the two men were connected, the investigators contacted the New York State prison system.
They combed through countless records that they keep, whether they be visitor logs or telephone logs, and during their investigation and discovered telephone conversations between Murray and Camper.
Large amount of phone activity between John Murray and Beatrice while he was incarcerated.
There was hundreds of phone calls, hundreds.
More than 900 alone in the last 11 months of John's sentence.
That's 2 to 3 calls per day that John and Beatrice were making to each other.
And it wasn't just phone calls either.
Go through back records of visitors that had come to see John Murray while he was incarcerated, and there was numerous visits from Beatrice.
And since Terry's wife was the connection to John Murray, the next question the investigators needed to answer was just how did Beatrice know the ex-con?
There was definitely a relationship there, and it was a long relationship.
It was John Murray's friend Sandra Dolman, the woman who'd put the investigators onto him in the first place, who revealed just how long Beatrice had known him.
They known each other in Queens years before this happened.
They'd started out as neighbors, but had quickly become much more.
John is a very charismatic guy. He's a handsome guy. He's a funny guy.
And he had been Beatrice's first love.
John and Beatrice had a relationship, a physical relationship. There were a lot of drugs involved, and they were kind of on the street a little bit, but they were very much in love.
But in 1977, the couple's intense and tumultuous love affair had come to an abrupt end.
He was ultimately convicted in Queens on 2 homicides, and he did about 30 years in jail for those.
And while John was in jail, Beatrice had lost touch.
She moved. She had this whole other life.
A full life with children and grandchildren, culminating in her decade-long marriage to Terry Camper. But in 2002, shortly after she met Terry, John was suddenly back in Beatrice's life.
While John was incarcerated, Beatrice had gone to this fair where they allow, inmates and visitors to sort of interact. And Beatrice was invited by a friend of hers who was visiting her own family member, and Beatrice accompanied her to this fair where she happened to run into John Murray. And then they started, writing letters back and forth to each other.
And based on the prison logs, the letters, phone calls, and visits had continued and intensified for the next 10 years, despite the fact that Beatrice was married to Terry.
John and Beatrice, at one point, were talking, pretty much daily.
But what did that relationship have to do with Terry's murder? His family believed they knew. They told the investigators that at the beginning of the marriage, Terry and Beatrice had gotten along well.
He seemed very happy. And I thought she was happy too.
But in the last few years of their decade-long marriage, the family had noticed a change.
I think she was falling out of love with Terry.
Not only did Terry's cousin think that Beatrice was falling out of love, she thought that Beatrice might be seeing someone else.
It's just the changes in her. She would fix up different. Her hair, her clothing was different. And always going somewhere on the weekend.
According to Beatrice, she was visiting her daughter, who lived in Yonkers. But Terry's cousin wasn't so sure.
I think she had someone else on the side.
And according to his sister, Terry was growing suspicious too.
He came up to me, he says, there's something not right with her, with B.
But the family said that Terry was determined to stick things out.
He loved her. He wanted to make his marriage work.
And that became increasingly difficult as time went on, according to the family.
She would be a little mean to him. She would talk down to him.
She got to the point where every time he'd say something, she yelled and screamed. I'm like, why is that?
I said, why do you keep taking it? He said, well, that's my wife, and I want my marriage to work. I said, but you don't have to take abuse like that. I said, not to make a marriage work. I said, both of you have to want it. Apparently, she doesn't want it. Anyway, he said, well, please don't talk about my wife.
Terry's sister said that barely a week before her brother's death, she'd urged him to leave Beatrice.
He says, neither one of us is happy. I said, wasn't you time to get out of that? I said, because nothing comes good out of a relationship when both of you are not happy.
But she said that he'd refused.
He said, I can't leave because she has nowhere to go. I said, move in with me and my mother. He's like, I just can't move out the apartment.
Had that decision cost Terry his life? His family was convinced.
His mother, Susie, says, that bitch killed my son.
Based on what they'd learned about her marriage and her connection to John Murray, the investigators brought Beatrice in for questioning on the afternoon of October 4th.
Detectives asked her if she had known a John Murray.
First, she denied knowing him. And when we knew that that was false.
And as far as the investigators were concerned, the fact that she'd lied about knowing John was just as telling.
You know, we're onto something here.
And not just in the interrogation room. Because when the investigators brought Beatrice in for questioning, they also executed a search warrant for the apartment she shared with Terry.
During the execution of the search warrant in Miss Camper's apartment, detectives recovered a box that contained hundreds of letters of correspondence between Beatrice and John.
Love letters that she had kept when John Murray was in prison, sending her love letters almost daily.
Me and my partner kind of looked at each other and we're like, wow, you know, she's really, you know, she's involved in this.
The plot thickened, so to speak.
Once we began to see what was written in them, we realized now we had motive.
The investigators searching the apartment immediately passed on what they'd found to their counterparts in the interrogation room, who turned up the heat on Beatrice.
They started to bring out, you know, the proof that they had, that Beatrice had made phone calls to John Murray, and John Murray had made phone calls to Beatrice.
And once she realized just how much the police already knew, Beatrice's story began to change.
Beatrice started to tell us what had happened.
She started out by admitting that she did know John Murray.
She told us that she was actually involved in an affair with him.
She would leave saying she was going to visit her daughter when she wasn't. She was going to meet John Murray.
And according to Beatrice, during those meetups, eventually they began talking about ways to get Terry out of the picture.
She decided that, you know, she needed to come clean, and she gave us the information that she had conspired with Mr. Murray to kill her husband.
She did admit that, you know, her and John had been planning this for quite a while, and that, you know, she was involved in the, in the murder of her husband.
Although according to Beatrice, it was John's idea, one that she'd gotten swept up in, foolishly obsessed with the prospect of being reunited with her first love.
I think the guilt was weighing on her. She couldn't handle it anymore. A weight was lifted off of her. She definitely seemed very remorseful. You know, I'm sure there had to be some kind of satisfaction as to, holding all that guilt inside, obviously coming out and telling the truth at this point.
But would Beatrice's confession do her any good? Despite her cooperation, the Peekskill police placed her under arrest for Terry's murder.
She provided all the information that Murray needed to pull this off.
And thanks to Beatrice's confession, the investigators also felt they had enough to charge John Murray with murder.
He was taken into custody up in Newburgh.
When John Murray was arrested, he basically had no reaction, didn't even ask why.
After all, John was a convicted killer. But in the weeks ahead, some people would be wondering, was he also a pawn? Coming up, will Beatrice's confession be enough to convict John?
There was no hard evidence against John Murray whatsoever.
Or will John turn on Beatrice?
He had given that phone to Beatrice Camper.
By April 9th, 2014, it had been a year and a half since Beatrice Camper's husband, Terry, had been murdered while driving his taxi cab in Peekskill, New York.
Everyone had nothing but good things to say about Terry. Terry was a very well-known local cab driver.
Beatrice and a 62-year-old ex-con named John Murray had both been charged with the murder.
That was her boyfriend. They had corresponded while he was in prison.
In fact, at the time of her arrest in October of 2012, Beatrice had confessed to her role in the crime.
The guilt and the weight of this crime was definitely weighing on her. You could see it in her.
And it obviously still weighed on the 62-year-old grandmother when she walked into a Westchester County, New York courtroom that morning.
She had aged terrible. She didn't look like the same person that I had seen before. This process had taken a lot from her.
However, while she had been charged with second-degree murder for her role in the crime, she hadn't come to court to stand trial. Instead, she was there to testify against her old flame, John Murray, who was on trial for his alleged role in Terry's murder.
John was just adamant that he did not commit this crime and that he was being charged based on the fact that he had a bad prior record, and he was adamant that he was being railroaded.
But did Beatrice's old boyfriend have a point? After all, while they had considerable circumstantial evidence against him, the only thing directly connecting him to Terry's murder was Beatrice's confession. And the prosecutors had done everything in their power to secure her testimony against John.
The Westchester District Attorney's Office offered her a plea deal in exchange for her testimony against John.
That's a decision that was made to get the actual shooter, the trigger man. He definitely needed to be in jail for life, so that was the goal.
And it was no surprise that Beatrice had accepted the DA's offer.
I think Beatrice's primary motive was to lessen her responsibility in this case by pointing the finger at John Murray.
But could she close the deal for the prosecutors? When Beatrice took the stand, the entire case was riding on her testimony.
There was no firearm recovered. There were no eyewitnesses to the actual crime. There was no DNA evidence or any other forensic evidence.
There was no hard evidence against John Murray whatsoever. The only thing linking John Murray to this crime really is the testimony of Beatrice Camper.
On the stand, Beatrice began by explaining the background, how throughout her marriage to Terry, she and John had been having a secret affair.
She had romantic involvement with Mr. Murray, despite the fact that they were separated by prison bars.
And if the letters he'd sent her from prison were any indication, their romance had been pretty steamy, too.
She saved all of the letters, every single one of them, I believe, was recovered from her apartment. In the letters, it was a very sexually explicit relationship.
And if the hundreds of letters John had sent her weren't enough to prove just how devoted he was to Beatrice, the prosecutors also played tapes of the prison phone calls between the lovers.
There were a number of calls that the DA's office played. Some of them highlighted a lot of erotic talk and discussions of having sex.
And Beatrice said that once John was released from prison, the lovers had turned years of talk into reality, despite the fact that they were both married.
When John was released, he and Beatrice basically immediately met up.
And according to Beatrice, the affair continued for the next 11 months.
She was visiting him. They would get together.
However, Beatrice claimed that the affair wasn't the only motive behind Terry's murder.
They was in the plot to kill him for life insurance money.
At the time of his death, Terry had 2 insurance policies, totaling $100,000.
their goal was to get rid of Mr. Camper and collect on that life insurance policy.
And one of those policies had been taken out barely a year before Terry's murder.
Shortly before your spouse dies, changing an insurance policy does not look good for the living spouse.
However, according to Beatrice, John was the one who pushed her to up the coverage, and the prosecutors had the audio tape to prove it.
They had quite a few discussions about that policy, discussions that were recorded on tape when Mr. Murray was in prison.
There is a conversation that takes place in which John tells Beatrice, in so many words, you need to up his, meaning Terry's, insurance policy. And in response, a few days later, Beatrice calls John and tells him, look, I did what you asked me to do. I changed the insurance policy.
When I heard all this in court, I was very shocked to the things that was going on and what she was doing behind Terry's back.
Although, as both Beatrice and the prosecutors stressed, she only did it because John told her to.
She would do anything for John.
But as Beatrice told the jury, once Terry was dead, she'd immediately regretted what she'd done.
I don't think she really thought this through. Her relationship with John Murray, she got wrapped up in it.
She kept on saying that she was sorry. She didn't even want any of this to happen.
That's what Beatrice claimed, but was it the truth? Not according to John's defense attorney.
She shouldn't be believed because she's going to testify against John so that her jail time is reduced.
Instead, when John's defense presented their case, the scenario they laid out was the exact opposite of what Beatrice claimed.
Almost all of it came from Beatrice. It was Beatrice who was going to change these policies, and John sort of just went along with it.
And since Beatrice's testimony was the only thing that directly connected John to the crime, the defense maintained that he was completely innocent.
John was just adamant that he did not commit this crime.
And they reminded the jury that the prosecutors had no murder weapon and no evidence to actually put him in Terry's car.
They are circumstantial. Could be coincidences. It could be a different car. It could have been anyone who drove that phone and threw it up there.
And the call from his phone that pointed to him in the first place. The defense claimed that John wasn't the one who made that call.
He had given that phone to Beatrice Camper before the day of the homicide.
Beatrice had actually provided John with that phone so they can talk privately anytime Beatrice and John wanted.
But why would John give Beatrice back the phone that served as their secret hotline?
John had, in fact, ended the relationship with Beatrice. And Beatrice was very upset with the fact that John no longer wanted to be with her. That was not acceptable to Beatrice. She continued to pursue John even after the fact.
And according to the defense, it was Beatrice who had killed Terry.
John Murray put everything on her, that she shot him, and he was pushing it on her.
The defense claimed that Beatrice had not only murdered Terry, they said that she was obsessed with John Murray, and she had intentionally dumped her dead husband's phone on the way to John's house to frame her ex-boyfriend for the murder.
We tried to put it on Beatrice entirely that it was her, and that was John's argument, and that's what we felt the evidence showed.
Coming up, the jury makes its decision.
There's a lot of tension in the courtroom.
But will they believe Beatrice?
John was beside himself.
On April 17, 2014, the jury announced that it had reached a verdict in the murder trial of Beatrice Camper's ex-boyfriend, John Murray.
They deliberated for the better part of a day.
The 62-year-old ex-con was accused of killing Beatrice's husband, Terry.
Her and John planned this together.
At least that's what Beatrice had testified in court as part of her plea deal.
The DA's office offered her a fixed amount of time in jail, and in return for that, she would have to testify against John.
John's defense, on the other hand, argued that Beatrice was Terry's killer.
They both was blaming each other.
What's more, according to the defense, Beatrice had set up John to take the fall for her crime after John put an end to their affair.
Beatrice was pointing this on him based on the fact that he had a bad prior record.
I think Beatrice is a very manipulative person.
And in the end, The case basically came down to who the jury believed, Beatrice or John.
There was a lot of tension in the courtroom.
John knew what the stakes were. He knew that he was looking at a lifetime sentence without the possibility of parole.
But would he get it?
The jury found John Murray guilty of murder.
John was very upset at the verdict. He was beside himself.
And he was going to prison for life.
He would never see daylight again, per the judge. And I agree with that. And he got just what he deserved.
But what about Beatrice? She was technically serving life too, but the terms of her plea deal meant that parole was an option.
She's looking at, 15 years to life.
And the thought that Beatrice could get out in as little as 15 years leaves Terry's family more than a little disappointed.
I think she needs to be in prison the rest of her life.
The family is determined to see that she stays there, too.
When she goes before the board, the family will plan to be there to say she deserves to stay longer.
And despite the deal the prosecutors made in order to put John in prison, the investigators basically agree with Terry's family.
To have such a premeditation involved, to have plans having been made for so long to do this, and she's just as guilty as the man who pulled the trigger. There was plenty of opportunity for these two to say, what are we thinking here? This is horrible. We can't do this. No, they kept chugging along, man. They executed these plans, and they executed Terry Camper. That's just pure evil.
There are some places that seem, by their very nature, to be built for trust. A church is one of them. It is a place where strangers can sit beside one another, where a visitor can enter without first being asked what he believes or where he comes from, and where an evening gathering can begin with something as ordinary as a Bible study. On June 17, 2015, that was what was happening inside Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. The church, widely known as Mother Emmanuel, was a historic institution within Charleston's African American community. That evening, people had gathered for Bible study, expecting the kind of quiet, familiar meeting that had taken place there many times before. Among those who entered the church that night was a 21-year-old man named Dylan Stormroof. He did not arrive by accident. By the time he walked through the doors of Mother Emmanuel, the evidence later gathered by investigators would show that he had spent months preparing for an attack against African Americans. He had already acquired the weapon. He had obtained ammunition. He had practiced shooting. He had researched churches. And, according to evidence recovered after his arrest, Emmanuel AME was at the top of a list of predominantly African American churches in Charleston. But inside the church that evening, none of that was immediately visible. Roof was not treated as an obvious threat. He was accepted into the gathering as a visitor and remained among the people there for more than half an hour. That detail would become one of the most painful elements of the case. The people inside had no reason to understand that the young man sitting among them had come with a very different purpose. The evening had begun as a gathering centered on faith. What happened next would leave 9 people dead and transform Mother Emmanuel into one of the most recognizable sites associated with racial violence in modern American history. To understand the crime, however, it is important not to begin with the gunfire. It is important to begin with the people who were there, and with the place they had chosen to gather. Emmanuel AME Church was not simply a building where the shooting occurred. It was a historic church serving Charleston's African American community, and that fact was central to the significance of the attack. Roof's target was not one particular person with whom he had a personal dispute. According to the federal case against him, his intended victims were African Americans as a group. His ideology was rooted in white supremacist beliefs. and prosecutors described his objective as an attempt to increase racial tensions and encourage what he imagined as a race war. The distinction matters. This was not presented by investigators as an ordinary dispute that suddenly became violent. The evidence pointed toward a planned attack motivated by racial hatred. Months before June 17th, Roof had already begun taking concrete steps. On April 16, 2015, he purchased the Glock .45 that would later be used in the massacre. In the months that followed, he obtained additional ammunition and magazines. Investigators also found evidence that he had practiced shooting at home. These details established something critical. The attack was not simply a spontaneous eruption of violence. It had preparation behind it. There was a weapon. There was ammunition. There was practice. There was research. And there was a target list. Investigators later recovered from Roof's vehicle a list of churches that primarily served African American communities in Charleston. Emmanuel AME appeared at the top. Telephone data also showed a brief call from Roof's home to Mother Emanuel in February 2015. The supplied evidence does not establish what was said during that call. And that distinction is important. What can be established is that the contact existed. Taken together with the other evidence, it became part of the larger picture investigators were assembling after the massacre. By the evening of June 17th, the pieces of that preparation had converged. At approximately 8 p.m., Roof arrived at Emmanuel AME Church at 110 Calhoun Street. Inside, the Bible study was underway. He entered carrying the Glock .45 and multiple magazines. He joined the gathering and remained there for more than 30 minutes. The people around him continued with the meeting. At some point, the gathering moved into prayer. It was then that the character of the evening changed completely. Roof opened fire. According to the federal case materials, he fired more than 70 rounds from the Glock .45. 9 people were killed. 5 others inside the church survived. The victims were not chosen because of individual conflicts with Roof. They were members of or connected to the African American church community that he had deliberately selected. Their ages ranged from 26 to 87. They included ministers, church members, a librarian, a church employee, a teacher, and a state senator. Among them was Reverend Clementa Pinckney, who was both a minister and a South Carolina state senator. But in the immediate aftermath, they were not political symbols or statistics. They were 9 people who had entered a church that evening expecting to participate in Bible study. Cynthia Graham Hurd was 54. Susie Jackson was 87. Ethel Lance was 70. Reverend DePayne Middleton Doctor was 49. Reverend Clementa Pinckney was 41. Tawanza Sanders was 26. Reverend Daniel Simmons Sr. was 74. Sharonda Coleman Singleton was 45. Myra Thompson was 59. 9 names, 9 lives. 9 people whose evening ended in a place that had been intended for prayer and community. After the shooting, Roof left the church. The investigation that followed would quickly expand beyond the immediate question of who had carried out the attack. Authorities would have to determine why this particular church had been chosen, how long the plan had existed, what evidence could demonstrate Roof's intentions, and whether anyone else had known about his plans before the shooting occurred. On June 18th, the FBI released information seeking the suspect in the Charleston church killings. Roof was subsequently located and arrested in North Carolina. His capture was an important turning point because the suspect was alive, and investigators could now examine not only the physical evidence surrounding the crime, but also the history and preparations that had preceded it. What emerged was a picture of deliberate targeting. The weapon had been purchased months earlier. Ammunition had been acquired. Shooting practice had taken place. Churches had been researched. A list had been compiled. Emmanuel AME had been identified as the primary target. And the ideology behind the attack was not hidden behind an ordinary personal motive. Investigators found evidence of racist and white supremacist beliefs, while prosecutors argued that Roof wanted his actions to inflame racial tensions. In July 2015, a federal grand jury indicted him on 33 counts, including federal hate crime-related offenses, interference with religious exercise, and firearm offenses. The case was therefore no longer understood simply as the story of one night in a church. It had become the story of a plan that had developed over months and culminated in the deaths of 9 people. Yet even that description leaves something important unanswered. A criminal case can explain the weapon, the target, the preparation, and the charges. It can reconstruct a timeline. It can assign responsibility. But it cannot turn 9 deaths into numbers on a page. To understand what happened at Mother Emanuel, the story must return to the people who were inside that room, people who had gathered for Bible study, people who welcomed a visitor, people who had no reason to believe that the man sitting among them had entered the church with the intention of killing them. The investigation would eventually reveal how much preparation had preceded that evening. The courts would later determine Roof's guilt and punishment. But before the legal process could begin, there was the simple and irreversible fact with which the investigation started. On June 17, 2015, 9 people went to Emmanuel AME Church. They came into a place associated with faith and community. Only 5 would leave alive. The other 9 would become the center of a case that exposed the destructive consequences of racial hatred and violent extremism, while leaving Charleston and the wider country to confront a question that reached far beyond one gunman. How does hatred develop into a plan? And how does that plan eventually find its way through the doors of a place where people had gathered simply to pray? Before the shooting became a federal case, before the indictment and the death sentence, before investigators began reconstructing months of preparation, there were 9 people inside Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church who had come together for a simple purpose: Bible study. Their presence that evening is the human center of the Charleston Church massacre. It is easy, when describing a crime of this magnitude, to begin with the perpetrator, the weapon, the ideology, and the investigation. But doing so can unintentionally allow the person responsible for the violence to occupy the center of the story. The people who died deserve the opposite. Their lives should come first. Mother Emanuel was a historic church within Charleston's African-American community, and its importance made the choice of location significant. The attack was not directed at a random building. According to the evidence presented in the federal case, Dylan Roof had researched churches primarily serving African-American communities in Charleston, and Emmanuel AME was at the top of the list later found in his vehicle. The church therefore became more than the setting of a crime. It was a deliberate target selected because of the community it represented. On June 17, 2015, however, the people inside were not gathering because they expected to become part of a national story. They were there for Bible study. Among them were ministers, church members, a librarian, a church employee, a teacher, and a state senator. Their ages ranged from 26 to 87, a span of generations gathered together in the same place. The youngest victim was Tawanza Sanders, 26. The oldest was Susie Jackson, 87. Between them were 7 other people whose lives had followed different paths but had brought them into the same church that evening. Cynthia Graham Hurd was 54 years old. She was a librarian, and she was among those who died inside Mother Emanuel. Her presence represents one of the ordinary dimensions of the gathering, people whose lives extended far beyond the walls of the church and whose identities could not be reduced to the circumstances of their deaths. Susie Jackson was 87 and a longtime member of the church. Her age placed her at the opposite end of the generational spectrum from Tawanza Sanders. Yet both were present at the same Bible study on the same evening. That simple fact captures something important about the gathering. It was not an assembly of people who shared only an age or occupation. It was a community that brought together generations. Ethel Lance, 70, was an employee of the church. She was another person whose connection to Mother Emanuel was part of the fabric of the place itself. DePayne Middleton Doctor was 49 and a minister. Daniel Simmons Sr. was 74 and also a minister. Sharonda Coleman Singleton, 45, was both a minister and a teacher. Their presence meant that the group included people whose lives were connected to religious service and education, as well as those who came simply as members of the congregation. Clementa Pinckney was 41. He was a minister, but he was also a South Carolina state senator. His death, therefore, brought another dimension to the tragedy. He was not only a member of the church community, but also a public official serving the state. Yet on that evening, the role that mattered inside the room was not his political position. He was one of the people gathered for Bible study. The fact that he was a state senator would later become an important part of the public understanding of the massacre. But it did not explain why he was killed. The evidence pointed elsewhere. Roof's target was African Americans, and the church had been deliberately selected as a place where African American worshipers gathered. The same was true of Tawanza Sanders, the youngest of the 9 victims. At 26, he represented a younger generation within the church community. His presence, alongside an 87-year-old longtime member, such as Susie Jackson, illustrated the breadth of the group Roof attacked. Myra Thompson, 59, was another church member killed that evening. Each name contributes another piece to the picture of the gathering. This was a group of people connected by a church and brought together by a shared religious activity. The 9 victims were not a collection of strangers selected for individual reasons. They were members and leaders of a community deliberately targeted because of their race. That distinction became central to the federal prosecution. It also explains why the crime carried consequences beyond the immediate loss of life. The attack was interpreted as an act of racial hatred directed against African Americans and against a historic African American church. There were 5 people inside the church who survived the shooting. The supplied evidence does not provide their individual accounts or detailed descriptions of what they experienced, and those details should not be invented. What can be stated is that 5 people survived while 9 others did not. That number creates a stark boundary between the people who remained alive and the people whose lives ended that night. The absence of further detail should not make their survival seem less significant. It simply means that the story must respect the limits of the available evidence. In a case surrounded by extensive public attention, restraint is important. The victims themselves should not become characters in a story built from speculation. What is known is enough to understand the essential human tragedy. 9 people went to Mother Emanuel. They represented different generations and different roles within their community. They gathered for Bible study. A visitor entered the church and was accepted into the gathering. More than half an hour passed before the shooting began. Then the evening became a massacre. The evidence later gathered against Roof showed that the attack had not been improvised. He had acquired the Glock .45 used in the shooting on April 16, 2015. He had subsequently obtained ammunition and magazines, and investigators found evidence that he had practiced shooting at home. His vehicle contained a list of predominantly African American churches in Charleston, with Emanuel AME at the top. Telephone data also showed a brief call from his home to Mother Emanuel in February. None of these facts describes the victims themselves, but together they explain the terrible significance of the place where the victims happened to be. The church had been selected before they ever knew that a danger was approaching. That is perhaps one of the most difficult aspects of the case to understand. The people inside did not need to have done anything to Roof personally. They did not need to know him. They did not need to be involved in a conflict with him. The federal case established that the attack was connected to his white supremacist ideology and his desire to target African Americans. The victims were caught within that ideology simply because they belonged to the community he had chosen as his enemy. That is why their individual identities matter. They remind us that hatred can transform real human beings into abstract categories in the mind of someone committed to an extremist worldview. Cynthia Graham Hurd was not merely one of 9. She was a 54-year-old librarian. Susie Jackson was not merely a number in a federal indictment. She was 87 and had been a longtime member of her church. Ethel Lance was not simply a name in a case file. She was 70 and worked at the church. DePayne Middleton Dr. and Daniel Simmons Sr. were ministers. Clementa Pinckney was a minister and state senator. Tawanza Sanders was 26. Sharonda Coleman Singleton was a minister and teacher. Myra Thompson was a church member. Their lives contained roles, relationships, responsibilities, and histories that cannot be captured by the number 9. The tragedy of June 17, 2015, is therefore not simply that 9 people died. It is that 9 individual lives were deliberately targeted inside a place where they had gathered. In community, the ages of the victims, from 26 to 87, make the loss span generations. Their professions and positions show how broad the community was, and their presence at Bible study shows how ordinary the beginning of the evening had been. The contrast between that ordinary beginning and the violence that followed is essential too. Understanding the case, Roof entered a place where people had opened the door to him. They had gathered for faith, not confrontation. They had no reason, based on the supplied evidence, to understand that the visitor among them had spent months preparing an attack. When the investigation began, authorities would examine the weapon, the ammunition, the church list, the telephone data, Roof's ideology, and the preparations that had preceded the shooting. But all of those pieces of evidence ultimately point back to the same room and the same 9 people. The investigation could establish how Roof prepared. The courts could determine what crimes he had committed. The sentence could establish the legal consequence. None of those processes could restore the people who had entered Mother Emanuel that evening. Their absence became the most enduring fact of the case. And so, before the story moves deeper into Roof's ideology and the months of preparation that preceded June 17th, it is worth holding on to the simplest truth. The people inside Mother Emanuel were there because they belonged to a community. They were there to study, to pray, and to spend an evening together. They did not enter the church expecting history to remember their names. But after that night, their names became inseparable from one of the most consequential acts of racial violence in modern American history. The story that follows must therefore be told with those names still at its center. The shooting at Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church lasted only a short time, but the evidence gathered afterward showed that the story had begun months earlier. Long before Dylan Roof entered Mother Emanuel on June 17, 2015, he had already taken steps that would eventually become central to the federal case against him. The weapon had been purchased, ammunition had been acquired, shooting practice had taken place, churches had been researched, a list had been created. And behind those actions was an ideology that identified African Americans as the people Roof wanted to target. This distinction is essential because it separates the Charleston massacre from an act of spontaneous violence. The available evidence described something that had been prepared. It was not simply a moment of anger that suddenly became deadly. It was an attack that, according to the federal case, developed over a period of months and was driven by racial hatred. At the center of that preparation was Roof's belief in white supremacy. Investigators found evidence that he had studied, written, and preserved material expressing racist and white supremacist ideas. His ideology was not incidental to the crime. Prosecutors argued that it provided the motivation for the attack and shaped the choice of victims. In location, Roof's intended victims were not selected because of a personal dispute with any one of them. They were African Americans. His target was therefore a racial group, and Mother Emanuel became the place where that hatred was directed. According to the federal case, Roof wanted to increase racial tensions and encourage what he imagined as a race war. The phrase describes his objective, not a reality that existed around him. It was the worldview through which he interpreted the people he intended to attack. Understanding that distinction matters. The investigation did not need to invent a motive after the shooting. Evidence collected during the case connected his ideology to his preparation and to his selection of an African-American church. One of the clearest pieces of evidence was the firearm. On April 16, 2015, Roof purchased the Glock .45 that he would later use in the massacre. The date is important because it places the acquisition of the weapon approximately 2 months before the shooting. The purchase was therefore part of a period of preparation rather than something acquired at the last moment. In the weeks that followed, Roof also obtained additional ammunition and magazines. Investigators later found evidence that he had practiced shooting at home. Taken together, these facts created a sequence: the acquisition of a weapon, the acquisition of additional ammunition and magazines, and practice with firearms. Each individual action might appear limited when viewed separately. Together, they formed part of the preparation for what would happen at Mother Emanuel. But the weapon was only one part of the plan. Investigators also examined where Roof intended to use it. After his arrest, authorities found a list in his vehicle containing churches that primarily served African American communities in Charleston. At the top of that list was Emmanuel AME Church. That discovery was particularly significant because it connected the ideology to a specific location. Roof was not merely expressing hostility toward African Americans in the abstract. He had identified places where African Americans gathered and had placed Mother Emanuel at the top of the list. The church's importance within Charleston's African American community therefore became part of the meaning of the evidence. The location had been selected because of the community it represented. There was another piece of evidence that investigators could place on the timeline. Telephone data showed that in February 2015, a brief call had been made from Roof's home to Mother Emanuel. The supplied evidence does not establish what was said during that call. That limitation is important. It would be easy, after knowing what happened in June, to imagine a conversation and give it a meaning that the evidence does not provide. But the documented fact is narrower and more precise. There was a brief call from Roof's home to Mother Emanuel several months before the shooting. Investigators could place that contact alongside the other evidence of preparation. They did not need to invent its contents to recognize its existence. By the time April arrived, the evidence of preparation became even more concrete. On April 16th, Roof obtained the Glock .45. Additional ammunition and magazines followed. Shooting practice was documented. The church list existed. And the ideology that prosecutors said motivated him remained at the center of the investigation. The sequence created a picture of deliberate preparation that would later be presented to a federal jury. Yet the most important question was not simply whether Roof had prepared. It was why. The answer provided by the prosecution was racial hatred. Roof's white supremacist beliefs led him to see African Americans as the target of an ideological struggle. Prosecutors argued that he wanted the killings to provoke racial tension and contribute to the racial conflict he imagined. In that worldview, the victims were not treated as individuals. They were treated as members of a group Roof had decided to attack. Mother Emanuel was therefore not simply a convenient location. It was a symbolically significant African American church. The choice of a Bible study gathering also meant that the people inside were vulnerable precisely because they were participating in an ordinary religious activity. They were not expecting an attack. They had no reason to believe that the visitor who entered the church had spent months preparing to kill them. That contrast between preparation and trust would become one of the defining characteristics of the case. Roof's preparations existed in private. The people he intended to attack continued their lives without knowing that a plan was being formed around them. The Glock existed before the massacre. The ammunition existed. The magazines existed. The shooting practice had already happened. The list of churches existed. Yet the 9 people inside Mother Emanuel did not know that the church at the top of that list had been selected. This is where the timeline becomes particularly stark. On February, there was a brief telephone connection between Roof's home and Mother Emanuel. On April 16th, he purchased the Glock .45. In the following months, he obtained additional ammunition and magazines and practiced shooting. At some point, the list of predominantly African American churches existed, with Emmanuel AME at the top. Then came June 17th. By the time Roof arrived at the church at approximately 8:00 p.m., the preparation was already behind him. He did not need to decide that night whether to acquire a weapon. He did not need to decide which church to visit. The evidence indicated that those decisions had already been made. The attack was therefore the final stage of a process that had begun much earlier. This is also why the investigation would focus so heavily on evidence beyond the crime scene itself. The shooting inside the church established the immediate tragedy. 9 people had been killed and 5 had survived. But the broader case required investigators to reconstruct the path that had led to that moment. The firearm established one part of that path. The ammunition and magazines established another. The shooting practice demonstrated preparation. The church list helped identify the intended target. The telephone data provided an earlier connection to Mother Emanuel. The ideological material provided the motive prosecutors would later argue before the court. None of these pieces alone could tell the entire story. Together, they formed the structure of the case. And yet there was something else investigators would have to examine. If Roof had planned the attack for months, had he told anyone? Had anyone known that the plan existed before 9 people were killed? That question would eventually lead investigators to another individual, Joseph Carlton Meek, and to an allegation that Roof had spoken about his intentions before the massacre. But before that second thread could be examined, the first was already clear. The evidence showed that June 17th was not the beginning of the story. It was the point at which months of preparation became action. Roof had selected a target. He had obtained a weapon. He had prepared ammunition. He had practiced shooting. And he had developed an ideology that prosecutors said was intended to turn racial hatred into violence. The people inside Mother Emanuel could not see any of that when he entered the church. To them, he was simply a young visitor joining a Bible study. That was the gap between their reality and his plan. They were participating in a religious gathering. He was carrying out an ideological attack. They saw a person entering their community. He saw members of a racial group he wanted to destroy. The tragedy of Charleston lies partly in that terrible difference. The victims had no reason to understand the danger because the plan had been constructed without their knowledge. By the time they realized what was happening, the preparation that had begun months earlier had reached its final stage. The evidence would later allow investigators and prosecutors to reconstruct the preparation step by step. But on June 17th, inside Mother Emanuel, there was no courtroom, no indictment, and no opportunity to examine the evidence. There was only a Bible study, a visitor, and a community that had opened its doors without knowing what he had planned to do. On the evening of June 17th, 2015, the months of preparation described in the investigation finally converged on one place: Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church in Charleston, South Carolina. By approximately 8 p.m., Dylan Roof had arrived at 110 Calhoun Street. Inside the church, a Bible study was underway. Nothing in the supplied evidence suggests that the people gathered there understood that they had been deliberately selected as targets. They were participating in a religious gathering, and Roof entered the church as a visitor. That detail is central to understanding what followed. The people inside did not initially treat him as an obvious threat. He was accepted into the gathering. He was allowed to sit among them. For more than half an hour, the man who had spent months preparing an attack remained in the presence of the people he intended to kill. The contrast between what Roof knew and what the people inside knew could hardly have been greater. Roof had already acquired the Glock .45 that would become the weapon used in the massacre. He had obtained additional ammunition and magazines. Investigators had found evidence that he had practiced shooting at home. His vehicle would later be found to contain a list of predominantly African-American churches in Charleston, with Emmanuel AME at the top. Telephone data would also show a brief call from his home to Mother Emanuel in February. All of those facts existed before June 17th. But inside the church that evening, none of those preparations were visible to the people around him. They were simply attending Bible study. Roof remained with the group for more than 30 minutes. The supplied evidence does not provide a detailed account of what was said during that period. So there is no basis for inventing a conversation or describing thoughts that cannot be established. What can be established is that Roof stayed inside the gathering long enough to become part of the scene before turning against the people who had accepted him. Eventually, those attending moved into prayer. It was during that moment that Roof began the attack. The event that followed was not a confrontation between two opposing groups. It was not a dispute that escalated unexpectedly. According to the federal case, Roof had entered the church with the intention of killing African Americans. He opened fire with a Glock .45. Federal case materials state that he fired more than 70 rounds. 9 people were killed. 5 others inside the church survived. The numbers are stark, but numbers alone cannot communicate the difference between the evening before and the moment after. Before the shooting, the room contained a group of people engaged in a shared religious activity. After the shooting, 9 members of that gathering were dead. The identities of those 9 people are important because they show the breadth of the community that was attacked. Cynthia Graham Hurd was 54 years old and worked as a librarian. Susie Jackson was 87 and a longtime member of the church. Ethel Lance was 70 and worked at the church. Reverend DePayne Middleton Doctor was 49 and a minister. Reverend Clementa Pinckney was 41, a minister and a South Carolina state senator. Tawanza Sanders was 26, the youngest of the 9 victims. Reverend Daniel Simmons Sr. was 74 and a minister. Sharonda Coleman Singleton was 45, a minister and teacher. Myra Thompson was 59 and a church member. Their ages ranged from 26 to 87. Their roles were different, their generations were different, and their lives extended far beyond the church room in which they died. What connected them that night was the community they shared and the Bible study they had attended. Roof's attack, according to the evidence presented in the federal case, did not distinguish between them based on personal conflict. They were targeted because they were African Americans. That fact is fundamental to the character of the crime. The violence was not simply directed at individuals who happened to be present. It was part of an attack motivated by Roof's white supremacist ideology and his stated desire to intensify racial tensions. His imagined race war was one of the concepts prosecutors used to explain the purpose behind the attack. The people inside Mother Emanuel became victims of an ideology that reduced human beings to racial categories. Yet the evidence does not suggest that those people had entered the church expecting any form of conflict. They had come for Bible study. They had welcomed a visitor. The attack, therefore, exploited the openness of a religious gathering. The same place that functioned as a center of faith and community became the scene of 9 deaths. The federal case later established that the attack involved more than 70 rounds. But the most significant fact is not the amount of ammunition. It is the deliberate choice to bring a firearm into a church and use it against people who were gathered for religious study. After the shooting, Roof left the church. The supplied data does not provide additional details about his movements immediately after leaving, nor does it provide individual descriptions from the 5 survivors. Those limits should remain intact. The story does not need invented details to establish the scale of the tragedy. 9 people had been killed. 5 people had survived. Roof had left the scene. The investigation now had to begin. The following day, June 18th, the FBI released information seeking the suspect in the Charleston church killings. The public identification of Roof marked the beginning of the search for the person responsible. He was not arrested immediately in Charleston. On June 18th, he was located and arrested in North Carolina. His capture became an important turning point because the investigation could now move beyond the immediate crime scene and examine the person believed to be responsible. Investigators could examine the weapon, his preparations, his church list, the telephone data, and the ideological material associated with him. The central question was no longer simply who had carried out the shooting. The evidence was beginning to answer that question. The deeper question was why. Why had Roof chosen Emmanuel AME? Why had he spent months preparing? Why had he selected an African-American church? Why had he remained among the people inside before opening fire? The evidence gathered after his arrest would help prosecutors construct an answer. His white supremacist beliefs were central. His preparation was documented. The church list connected him to potential African-American targets. Emmanuel AME stood at the top of that list. The firearm had been purchased 2 months earlier. Ammunition and magazines had been acquired. Shooting practice had taken place. The February telephone contact with Mother Emmanuel existed in the records. Together, those facts pointed toward a planned attack rather than an impulsive act. The investigation would therefore move quickly toward treating the massacre as more than a conventional homicide case. It would become a federal hate crime investigation involving interference with religious exercise and firearm offenses. But on the night of June 17th, none of those legal categories existed yet. There was only the immediate aftermath of the shooting and the realization that 9 people were dead. The significance of the location would become clearer as investigators reconstructed the evidence. Mother Emmanuel had been deliberately selected. The people inside had been deliberately targeted. And the attack had been prepared long before Roof entered the building. That sequence is what makes the incident so difficult to understand. The shooting itself was the visible part of the crime, but it was only the final act of a process that had begun months earlier. The preparation had occurred away from the church. The ideology had developed before that night. The weapon had been purchased in advance. The target had been identified. Then Roof walked through the doors of Mother Emmanuel and spent more than half an hour among the people he intended to kill. For those inside, the evening had begun as an ordinary Bible study. For Roof, according to the evidence, it was the culmination of a plan. That difference defines the tragedy. One group entered the church expecting faith and community. One man entered carrying an ideology of racial hatred and a firearm. When he finally opened fire, 9 people lost their lives. 5 survived. Roof left the church. And the investigation began with a question that would soon become much larger than the identity of the gunman. How much could be proven about what had been planned before he ever arrived at Mother Emmanuel? The investigation into the Charleston church massacre began with 9 people dead, 5 survivors, and a suspect who had left the scene. But as authorities began putting the evidence together, the case quickly moved beyond the question of who had pulled the trigger. The more important question became why Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church had been chosen. The answer would emerge through a combination of physical evidence, digital information, and material connected to Dylan Roof's preparations. What investigators found would transform the case from a mass shooting into a federal hate crime. Prosecution. On June 18, 2015, the day after the massacre, the FBI released information seeking Roof as the suspect in the Charleston church killings. The search was no longer limited to the immediate area surrounding Mother Emmanuel. Roof had left Charleston, and later that day, he was located and arrested in North Carolina. His arrest was a crucial turning point. The authorities now had the person they believed was responsible, and the investigation could begin examining not only the crime itself, but the circumstances that had preceded it. A living suspect meant that investigators could examine the history of the attack through evidence associated with Roof. The Glock .45 became one of the central physical pieces of evidence. Roof had purchased that firearm on April 16, 2015, approximately 2 months before the massacre. He had subsequently obtained additional ammunition and magazines, and investigators found evidence that he had practiced shooting at home. These facts helped establish preparation. They showed that the firearm used at Mother Emmanuel had not appeared in Roof's possession by chance. On the night of the attack, it had been acquired well in advance. The investigation then moved beyond the weapon itself. Investigators examined material connected to Roof's intended targets and found a list of predominantly African-American churches in Charleston in his vehicle. Emmanuel AME Church was at the top of that list. That discovery became one of the most significant pieces of evidence concerning target selection. It connected Roof directly to a group of churches serving African American communities and placed Mother Emanuel first among them. The church's identity was therefore not incidental. The location mattered because of the people who gathered there. Another piece of evidence came from telephone data. Investigators found that a brief call had been made from Roof's home to Mother Emanuel in February 2015, several months before the shooting. The supplied information does not establish what was said during that call. That limitation is important. A responsible reconstruction of the case cannot turn an unknown conversation into a fictional one. What the data establishes is that the call occurred. When placed alongside the church list and the other evidence of preparation, it became another point in the timeline that investigators could examine. The investigation was gradually revealing a pattern. There was a firearm purchased months before the massacre. There was additional ammunition and magazines. There was shooting practice. There was research into African American churches. There was a list with Emanuel AME at the top. There was an earlier telephone contact with the church. And there was an ideological motive centered on white supremacy and hatred toward African Americans. Individually, these pieces were limited. Together, they provided the framework for the federal prosecution's argument that the massacre had been deliberate and racially motivated. The question of motive became particularly important. Roof's beliefs were not treated as a secondary issue. Prosecutors argued that his white supremacist ideology was central to the attack. According to the federal case, he wanted to increase racial tensions and encourage what he imagined as a race war. That concept helped explain why he had selected an African American church rather than a random location. His intended victims were not chosen because of individual disputes. They were African Americans gathered in a place that represented an African American religious community. This is what distinguished the case from a conventional mass shooting. The crime involved not only the killing of 9 people but the deliberate targeting of a community because of race and religion. As investigators continued building the case, the federal government became involved. The evidence supported charges involving federal hate crimes, interference with religious exercise, and firearm offenses. In July 2015, a federal grand jury indicted Roof on 33 counts. The indictment represented a major shift in the case. The events of June 17th were now being examined through federal law, and the prosecution was preparing to establish that the killings were motivated by racial hatred and occurred in the context of an attack on religious worship. The number 33 represented multiple dimensions of the alleged conduct. The case was not simply 9 counts of murder. It involved federal offenses connected to religious exercise, hate crime, and firearms. The legal structure reflected the broader meaning investigators had assigned to the attack. Yet the evidence did not stop with the crime scene or the material found in Roof's possession. Investigators also began examining whether anyone had known about his plans before June 17th. That question would eventually lead them to Joseph Carlton Meek, an acquaintance of Roof. According to prosecutors, more than a week before the shooting, Roof told Meek that he intended to shoot people during a Bible study at an AME church in Charleston. Roof allegedly said that he had been planning the attack for more than 6 months and wanted it to serve as a catalyst for a racial conflict. If accurate, those statements were significant because they suggested that the plan had been spoken about before the massacre. The investigation, therefore, began to examine not only what Roof had done, but what information may have existed before he entered Mother Emanuel. Meek's involvement did not change the central evidence concerning Roof's responsibility for the shooting. Instead, it opened another investigative thread: whether someone had possessed information about the planned attack and failed to report it adequately. After the massacre, Meek was accused of knowing that Roof was responsible but not fully reporting what he knew to authorities. In 2016, Meek pleaded guilty to concealing a felony and making false statements. The legal outcome established that his case was separate from Roof's responsibility for the 9 killings. It also demonstrated how the investigation expanded beyond the immediate act of violence. Authorities were examining the chain of knowledge surrounding the crime, including whether Roof's intentions had been revealed before June 17th. At the same time, the core case against Roof continued to develop. The evidence showed that the attack had been prepared over months. His firearm had been purchased in April. Ammunition and magazines had been acquired. Shooting practice had taken place. The list of churches showed that African American religious institutions had been considered as potential targets, with Emmanuel AME at the top. The February telephone record provided an earlier connection to the church. His ideological material helped establish the racial motive that prosecutors would rely upon. The evidence was therefore cumulative. It did not depend on one dramatic discovery. Instead, investigators built the case by connecting multiple pieces that pointed in the same direction. This is one of the most important aspects of the Charleston investigation. The crime scene alone could establish that 9 people had been killed. It could establish that Roof had been present and had opened fire. But the broader federal case required investigators to demonstrate intent, motive, preparation, and the nature of the target. The evidence outside the church provided that larger context. The firearm purchase demonstrated advanced preparation. The ammunition and magazines demonstrated continued preparation. The shooting practice provided additional evidence that Roof was preparing to use the weapon. The church list connected his preparations to African American targets. The telephone data showed an earlier connection to Mother Emanuel. His white supremacist ideology supplied the motive prosecutors said explained the selection of the victims in the church, and the federal indictment brought those elements into a formal legal framework. By the summer of 2015, the story of Charleston was therefore no longer simply the story of what happened inside one church on one evening. It was the story of an attack that prosecutors believed had been conceived months earlier and directed at a particular racial and religious community. The investigation had moved from the immediate facts of the massacre to the architecture of the plan behind it. Yet one question remained particularly disturbing. If Roof had been preparing for months, and if he had spoken about the attack before it happened, was there someone who could have known what was coming? The investigation had already uncovered the evidence connecting Roof to Mother Emanuel. It had established the weapon, the preparation, the target list, and the ideology. Now it would examine the possibility that the plan had not been completely hidden. The answer would lead investigators to Joseph Carlton Meek and create another layer in a case that was already becoming one of the most significant federal hate crime prosecutions in modern American history. The investigation into the Charleston Church massacre had already established a disturbing pattern. Dylan Roof had acquired a firearm months before the attack. He had obtained additional ammunition and magazines. Investigators had found evidence that he practiced shooting at home. A list of predominantly African American churches had been recovered from his vehicle, with Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church at the top. Telephone data showed a brief call from Roof's home to Mother Emanuel in February 2015. And his white supremacist beliefs provided the ideological motive prosecutors said connected all of these actions. But as investigators continued examining the circumstances surrounding Roof, another question emerged. Had anyone known about the plan before June 17, 2015? That question led authorities to Joseph Carlton Meek, an acquaintance of Roof. Meek's role did not place him at the center of the massacre. The 9 killings remained the responsibility of Roof. But according to prosecutors, Meek had received information about Roof's intentions before the attack, information that would later become part of a separate criminal case. The allegation was serious because it concerned a moment before the tragedy, when the plan was still only a plan. According to prosecutors, more than a week before the shooting, Roof told Meek that he intended to shoot people during a Bible study at an African Methodist Episcopal church in Charleston. Roof allegedly also said that he had been planning the attack for more than 6 months. He described the planned violence as something that he wanted to use as a catalyst for a racial conflict. These alleged statements were significant because they corresponded closely with the motive. Investigators were already developing from the physical and documentary evidence. The case against Roof was not based on one source of information. His firearm purchase, his preparation with ammunition and magazines, his shooting practice, the church list, his connection to Mother Emanuel, and his white supremacist ideology had already created a picture of deliberate planning. The statements attributed to Roof by prosecutors provided another potential window into that. Preparation. They suggested that the plan had existed long before the night of the massacre, and that Roof had communicated at least some part of it to another person. But there is an important distinction between an allegation made by prosecutors and an established fact concerning another person's knowledge or intentions. The supplied evidence identifies what prosecutors said Roof told Meek. It does not provide a transcript of the conversation, nor does it establish every detail of what Meek understood at the time. For that reason, the story should remain precise. Roof allegedly described an intended attack on a Bible study at an AME church in Charleston. He allegedly said that he had been planning it for more than 6 months, and he allegedly described the purpose in terms of provoking racial conflict. Those are the claims that became relevant to Meek's later prosecution. What happened afterward was equally important. After the massacre, Meek was accused of knowing that Roof was responsible but failing to fully report what he knew to authorities. The investigation therefore moved into a complicated area. The primary crime had already occurred. 9 people had been killed. 5 others had survived. Roof had left the church and was later arrested in North Carolina. Investigators now had to determine whether other people had possessed information about his plans, and whether their conduct after the attack constituted separate offenses. The case involving Meek did not replace the evidence against Roof. Instead, it existed alongside it. The central prosecution against Roof concerned the massacre itself. Meek's case concerned what he allegedly knew and how he responded to that knowledge. That distinction matters because it prevents the secondary case from obscuring the principal story. The evidence against Roof showed a planned attack motivated by racial hatred. The evidence concerning Meek addressed a different question: whether information about that plan had existed before the killings and whether Meek had properly dealt with what he knew. In 2016, Meek pleaded guilty to concealing a felony and making false statements. His guilty plea established the legal outcome of his case. It also became part of the wider story of the Charleston investigation because it demonstrated that authorities were examining not only the actions of the gunman, but also the information surrounding him. A mass shooting investigation often begins at the scene and then expands outward. In Charleston, the process followed that same direction. Investigators first had to identify the suspect. They then examined the weapon and other physical evidence. They studied Roof's preparation and his ideological material. They traced his connection to the church. They examined the list of potential targets. And then they asked whether anyone had known about his intentions before he entered Mother Emanuel. The Meek investigation represented that next layer. It raised a deeply uncomfortable question without changing the facts of the massacre itself. If Roof had described his intentions beforehand, what did that knowledge mean? Could it have been understood as a real warning? How much of the plan had actually been communicated? The supplied evidence does not provide enough information to answer those questions beyond the facts established in the case against Meek. It would therefore be wrong to construct an imagined conversation or assign Meek emotions or motives that are not contained in the available material. What can be said is that prosecutors considered his knowledge significant enough to bring separate charges, and that Meek ultimately pleaded guilty to concealing a felony and making false statements. The timing is also important. According to prosecutors, the alleged conversation occurred more than a week before the shooting. That means it came after Roof had already spent months preparing, but before the final attack. By then, according to the broader evidence, Roof's intentions were not merely an abstract expression of racist beliefs. He had acquired the weapon that would later be used. He was obtaining ammunition and magazines. He had practiced shooting. He had researched African American churches. Emmanuel AME was at the top of the list found in his vehicle. The alleged statements to Meek therefore existed within an already documented pattern of preparation. The case against Roof would eventually be presented to a federal jury, but the investigation had to establish that pattern first. The Meek case added another piece to the timeline. It suggested that Roof's plan may have been communicated to someone else before the massacre. That possibility made the period immediately preceding June 17th particularly important. The attack had not emerged from nowhere. The preparation had taken place over months. The weapon had been obtained. The target had been selected. The ideology had provided the motivation. And, according to prosecutors, Roof had spoken about the intended attack to an acquaintance. Then June 17th arrived. Roof went to Mother Emanuel. He entered the Bible study. He remained with the group for more than half an hour. When the gathering moved into prayer, he opened fire. 9 people were killed. 5 survived. Roof left the church and was arrested in North Carolina the following day. The investigation that followed would eventually produce a federal indictment containing 33 counts. But the existence of a second criminal case demonstrated that the authorities were not examining the massacre only as an isolated act. They were reconstructing the circumstances surrounding it, including what information had existed before and after the shooting. Meek's guilty plea in 2016 provided one legal conclusion within that broader investigation. It did not lessen Roof's responsibility, nor did it alter the identities of the 9 people who had been killed. Instead, it reinforced the importance of the timeline. The Charleston massacre had a before, a moment of violence, and an aftermath. The before included months of preparation and, according to prosecutors, a conversation in which Roof disclosed his intentions. The moment of violence was June 17th, when 9 people were murdered inside Mother Emanuel. The aftermath included Roof's arrest, the federal investigation, the prosecution of Meek, and eventually the federal trial of Roof himself. Each stage added another layer to the understanding of the crime. But there was still a distinction that the investigation could not erase. Knowing that Roof had planned the attack did not bring the victims back. Knowing that he had discussed the plan did not undo what happened inside the church. And discovering that another person later pleaded guilty to separate offenses did not change the central reality that 9 people had been deliberately targeted and killed. The investigation could reconstruct the chain of events, but it could not reverse the final link. By 2016, the legal system had already established one important fact concerning Meek. He had pleaded guilty to concealing a felony and making false statements. Meanwhile, the case against Roof was moving toward its most consequential stage. Federal prosecutors were preparing to prove that the Charleston massacre was not only a series of murders but an attack motivated by racial hatred and directed against people exercising their religion. The evidence gathered over the previous months would become central to that case. The church list, the firearm, the ammunition, the shooting practice, the telephone data, the ideological material, and the evidence concerning Roof's statements would all help prosecutors explain what had happened and why. The next question would no longer be whether Roof could be connected to the massacre. He had been identified, arrested, and charged. The question before the federal court would be whether the evidence established his guilt across the extensive list of federal charges. And, if it did, what punishment the law should impose for the deaths of 9 people inside a church. By the time Dylan Roof's case reached federal court, the basic facts of the Charleston church massacre were no longer in question. 9 people had been killed inside Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church. 5 others had survived. Roof had been arrested in North Carolina on June 18, 2015, one day after the shooting. Investigators had spent months examining the evidence surrounding the attack, and prosecutors had constructed a case that went far beyond the simple fact that Roof had opened fire. They argued that the massacre was a planned attack motivated by racial hatred, carried out inside a church because of the African American community gathered there. The federal case would ultimately contain 33 counts, reflecting several different aspects of the crime. The prosecution included federal hate crime-related offenses, interference with religious exercise, and firearm offenses. The charges were significant because they expressed the broader nature of the crime in legal terms. The government was not treating the deaths as isolated acts of violence. It was presenting them as the result of a deliberate attack against African Americans exercising their religion. The evidence assembled during the investigation provided the foundation for that argument. Roof had purchased the Glock .45 used in the massacre on April 16, 2015, approximately 2 months before the shooting. He had subsequently obtained additional ammunition and magazines. Investigators found evidence that he had practiced shooting at home. His vehicle contained a list of predominantly African American churches in Charleston, and Emanuel AME was at the top. Telephone data showed a brief call from his home to Mother Emanuel in February 2015. Investigators also found material demonstrating Roof's white supremacist beliefs. Taken together, these pieces of evidence supported the prosecution's position that the attack had been planned and that its motivation was racial. The case also contained evidence concerning Roof's alleged statements to Joseph Carlton Meek before the shooting. According to prosecutors, Roof had told Meek more than a week before the massacre that he intended to shoot people during a Bible study at an AME church in Charleston. Roof allegedly said that he had been planning the attack for more than 6 months and wanted it to become a catalyst for racial conflict. Meek's later guilty plea to concealing a felony and making false statements became part of the wider investigative history. But Roof's prosecution remained focused on the massacre itself. The legal process, therefore, had to answer a central question. Could the government prove that Roof had committed the federal offenses charged against him? The answer came in December 2016. A federal jury found Roof guilty on all 33 counts. The verdict represented the culmination of an investigation that had begun with the crime scene at Mother Emanuel and had expanded into Roof's preparations, his ideology, his selection of the church, and the federal legal consequences of the attack. The conviction established his responsibility under federal law for the extensive list of offenses brought against him. But the case was not finished. Because prosecutors were seeking the death penalty, the proceedings moved into the sentencing phase. This stage required the legal system to determine the appropriate punishment after the jury had already found Roof guilty. The question was no longer whether he was responsible for the crimes. The question was what punishment should follow those convictions. On January 10, 2017, the federal jury reached its decision. Roof was sentenced to death. The death sentence applied to 18 capital counts. 9 of those counts involved interference with religious exercise resulting in death, corresponding to the 9 people killed inside Mother Emanuel. The other 9 capital counts involved firearm offenses connected to the killings. The structure of the sentence reflected 2 different dimensions of the crime. The first concerned the people who had been exercising their religion when they were attacked. The second concerned the use of a firearm to carry out the murders. The sentence therefore formally recognized both the religious setting of the attack and the weapon used to commit it. Roof also received additional prison sentences on the remaining federal offenses, including life imprisonment without parole for certain counts. The combined result was an extraordinary federal punishment. The death sentence was the most severe penalty available under federal law, while the additional imprisonment ensured that the other convictions carried separate legal consequences. The decision also reflected the government's argument that the massacre was not simply an act of violence but a federal hate crime committed in a religious setting. The evidence presented throughout the case had helped establish the foundation for that interpretation. Roof's target selection was connected to African American churches. Emanuel AME was at the top of the list recovered from his vehicle. His ideological material demonstrated white supremacist beliefs. His preparation included obtaining the firearm and ammunition and practicing with the weapon. And the attack itself occurred during a Bible study inside a historic African American church. The legal process transformed those facts into formal findings of guilt. But a courtroom verdict could not capture the full human consequences of the crime. 9 people had died. Their names remained at the center of the case: Cynthia Graham Hurd, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lance, Reverend DePayne Middleton Dr., Reverend Clementa Pinckney, Tawanza Sanders, Reverend Daniel Simmons Sr., Sharonda Coleman Singleton, and Myra Thompson. Their ages ranged from 26 to 87. Their roles within the community varied. One was a librarian. One was a longtime church member. One worked at the church. Several were ministers. One was a teacher. One was a state senator. One was a younger church member. Yet the federal charges reduced their deaths to legal counts because the justice system had to translate an enormous human tragedy into a structure that could be tried in court. The verdict did not make those 9 people statistics, but it did necessarily organize their deaths into the language of federal law. The sentence also brought a second dimension to the case: the possibility of execution. Roof became one of the perpetrators of a mass killing to receive a federal death sentence. But the legal process did not end with the January 2017 sentencing decision. Roof continued to challenge his convictions and sentence through the appeals process. The existence of an appeal did not erase the jury's findings. Instead, it moved the case into another stage of the federal judicial system, where the convictions and sentence would be reviewed. In 2021, a federal appeals court upheld Roof's convictions and sentence. That decision preserved the legal outcome reached in the original federal proceedings. The result was therefore clear: Roof remained under a federal death sentence, with the convictions from the 2016 trial and the sentence imposed in January 2017 continuing to stand. The legal history of the case demonstrates how the justice system responded to the massacre in stages. First came the investigation, beginning immediately after the 9 killings. Then came the federal indictment in July 2015, when a grand jury charged Roof with 33 counts. In December 2016, a federal jury found him guilty on all 33 counts. In January 2017, the jury imposed the death penalty on the capital counts. And in 2021, a federal appeals court upheld the convictions and sentence. Each stage answered a different legal question. The investigation sought to determine what had happened. The indictment formally stated the government's allegations. The trial determined guilt. The sentencing phase determined punishment. The appeal examined whether the convictions and sentence should remain in place. The legal process could establish responsibility, but it could not undo the event itself. Nothing in the verdict could return the 9 people to their families or restore the evening that had been taken from them. That limitation is important when considering the outcome of the case. A death sentence may represent the maximum punishment under federal law, but it cannot be described as a restoration of what was lost. The legal system could impose consequences on Roof. It could formally recognize the nature of his crimes. It could establish that the victims had been attacked while exercising their religion and that racial hatred was central to the prosecution's case. But it could not reverse the deaths inside Mother Emanuel. The trial also gave the government an opportunity to present the massacre as a crime with a specific motive and structure. Roof's white supremacist ideology, the selection of an African-American church, the preparation of the firearm, the church list, and the evidence surrounding his plans all formed part of the broader narrative. The jury's verdict and sentence represented the legal conclusion reached from that evidence. In the end, the federal proceedings established a simple but profound distinction. The massacre was not left as an unexplained act of violence. The court process identified Roof as responsible, established his guilt on 33 federal counts, and imposed the death penalty on the capital offenses. But justice in a case like Charleston has another dimension that no verdict can completely resolve. The law can determine what happened to the person who committed the crime. It cannot determine how a community should live with the absence of 9 people. It cannot erase the memory of the church on June 17, 2015. And it cannot reduce the loss to a sentence, even when that sentence is the most severe punishment available. The federal case therefore closed one chapter of the Charleston story, but it did not end the questions raised by the massacre. The next chapter would concern what remained after the courtroom decisions, the survivors, the families of the victims, the community surrounding Mother Emanuel, the controversy surrounding Rufe's ability to obtain the firearm, and the broader consequences of an attack driven by racial hatred. The federal trial had established Dylan Rufe's criminal responsibility, and the sentence imposed in January 2017 represented the most severe punishment available under federal law. But the conclusion of the trial did not conclude the story of Charleston. The deaths of 9 people continued to affect their families, the survivors, the congregation of Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, and the wider community. At the same time, the massacre raised questions that extended beyond the courtroom. One of the most important concerned the firearm Rufe had used. Another concerned how a young man driven by white supremacist beliefs had been able to prepare an attack against an African-American church and carry it out with such devastating consequences. The case therefore left behind 2 different kinds of consequences. The first was personal and communal. 9 lives had been lost, and 5 people had survived an attack that permanently changed the meaning of June 17, 2015. The second was institutional. Questions emerged about firearms background checks, federal investigations, religious freedom, and the danger posed by extremist racial ideology. The firearm became particularly important after the massacre. Rufe had purchased the Glock .45 on April 16, 2015, roughly 2 months before he used it at Mother Emanuel. The federal investigation established that he had also acquired additional ammunition and magazines, and had practiced shooting at home. But after the massacre, attention focused on the circumstances that had allowed him to obtain the weapon. The issue eventually became the subject of civil litigation involving the federal government's background check system. The National Instant Criminal Background Check System, known as NICS, was designed to determine whether a prospective firearm purchaser was prohibited from possessing or receiving a firearm. The families of victims and survivors argued that the system had failed to identify information that should have prevented Rufe from purchasing the gun. Their claims created a second legal dimension to the Charleston tragedy. The original criminal case had focused on Rufe's actions and his responsibility for the 9 deaths. The civil cases instead raised questions about the systems surrounding the firearm purchase. Those cases did not ask whether Rufe had committed the massacre that had already been established. Instead, they examined whether the federal government's handling of the background check had contributed to his ability to obtain the weapon. In 2021, the Department of Justice announced an agreement resolving civil lawsuits related to the massacre. According to the supplied information, the settlement involved 14 plaintiffs, including families of people who were killed and survivors of the shooting, and the federal government agreed to pay a total amount of many millions of dollars. The settlement became an important part of the aftermath because it shifted attention toward institutional responsibility and the operation of the background check system. The question was no longer limited to what one individual had done. It became a question about whether a system intended to prevent prohibited firearm purchases had functioned as it should have. The civil settlement did not erase Rufe's criminal responsibility, nor did it change the finding that racial hatred and white supremacist ideology were central to his attack. But it demonstrated that the consequences of Charleston extended beyond the criminal courtroom. There were questions about how the weapon had reached Rufe, how the background check process had operated, and whether failures within that process had allowed a planned attack to proceed. These questions became part of the legal legacy of the massacre. The significance of the case also came from the place where the violence occurred. Emanuel AME was not simply another building in Charleston. It was a historic African-American church and an important institution within the community. By choosing that location, Rufe attacked more than the 9 individuals physically present inside. According to the federal case, he deliberately selected an African-American religious community because of the race of the people gathered there. That made the church itself an important part of the meaning of the crime. The attack demonstrated how a place associated with worship and community could become a target for ideological violence. It also demonstrated the danger created when extremist beliefs transform an entire racial group into an imagined enemy. Roof's objective, as described by federal prosecutors, was not limited to killing the people inside Mother Emanuel. He wanted the violence to contribute to increased racial tension and to what he imagined as a race. That intention helps explain why the case was treated as a federal hate crime. The attack was motivated by racial hatred and occurred in a place where people were exercising their religion. Those two elements became central to the federal charges and to the eventual capital counts for which Roof received the death penalty. But the consequences of the massacre cannot be measured only through statutes and court decisions. The 9 victims represented different generations and different roles within their community. Cynthia Graham Hurd was 54 and worked as a librarian. Susie Jackson was 87 and had been a long-time member of the church. Ethel Lance was 70 and worked at the church. Reverend DePayne Middleton Doctor was 49. Reverend Clementa Pinckney was 41, a minister and South Carolina state senator. Tawanza Sanders was 26. Reverend Daniel Simmons Sr. was 74. Sharonda Coleman Singleton was 45 and worked as both a minister and teacher. Myra Thompson was 59 and a church member. The range of their ages alone demonstrates the breadth of the loss. The youngest victim was 26. The oldest was 87. A single attack therefore removed people from different generations of the same community. The identities of the victims also demonstrate that the massacre affected more than one aspect of community life. Religious leaders died. A public official died. A librarian died. A teacher died. A church employee died. Longtime and younger members of the congregation died. The crime therefore created losses that could not be replaced by a single act of remembrance or a single court decision. 5 people survived inside the church. The supplied information does not provide detailed personal accounts from those survivors, so their experiences should not be reconstructed with invented dialogue or unsupported psychological descriptions. What can be stated is that they survived a shooting in which 9 others were killed. Their survival became another part of the lasting consequences of the attack. The same restraint is necessary when discussing the families of the victims. The supplied evidence does not provide individual descriptions of how each family responded, and it would be inappropriate to manufacture grief or private conversations. What is established is that families and survivors later became plaintiffs in civil litigation concerning the firearm background check process. Their participation in that legal process shows that the consequences of the massacre continued long after Roof's criminal conviction. The Charleston case also became a significant example of the way a criminal investigation can develop across multiple legal systems. The federal criminal prosecution established Roof's guilt and resulted in a death sentence. The appeal process later upheld those convictions and sentence in 2021. The civil litigation concerning the firearm purchase addressed a different set of questions. Meanwhile, the separate prosecution of Joseph Carlton Meek demonstrated another investigative dimension. Authorities examined whether people around Roof had possessed knowledge of his intentions before the attack. Meek pleaded guilty in 2016 to concealing a felony and making false statements. Together, these proceedings show that the legal consequences of Charleston did not consist of a single trial. They involved the gunman, an acquaintance who prosecutors said had information about the plan, and federal institutions connected to the firearm background check system. Yet none of these proceedings changed the central fact. On June 17, 2015, 9 people were killed because Roof deliberately targeted African Americans gathered inside a historic African American church. The evidence established that the attack had been prepared over months. The firearm had been purchased in advance. The target had been selected. The ideology had supplied the motive. The shooting had then transformed that preparation into irreversible loss. The consequences therefore extended in several directions at once. There was the criminal consequence for Roof, conviction on 33 federal counts and a death sentence on the capital offenses. There was the separate legal consequence for Meek, who pleaded guilty to concealing a felony and making false statements. There was the civil consequence involving the federal background check system and a multimillion-dollar settlement with plaintiffs that included victims' families and survivors. And there was the human consequence that no legal judgment could quantify. 9 people were gone. 5 people had survived. A historic church had become the site of a massacre motivated by racial hatred. The case also left behind a warning about the difference between extremist ideology and the violence that ideology can inspire. Roof's beliefs were not treated by investigators as an irrelevant private opinion. They were connected to his target selection, his preparations, and the stated objective of provoking racial conflict. His white supremacist ideology became part of the evidence explaining why Mother Emanuel had been chosen. That connection is essential because it prevents the massacre from being described simply as an act of random violence. It was targeted, it was prepared, and it was driven by a specific hatred. The legal system eventually recognized those elements, but recognition did not undo the damage. A conviction can establish responsibility. A sentence can impose punishment. A civil settlement can address institutional questions. None can restore the people who died. That is the boundary that remains at the end of the legal story. The Charleston massacre can be reconstructed through dates, evidence, charges, verdicts, and appeals, but the most important consequence is still the human one. 9 people entered Mother Emanuel on the evening of June 17, 2015. They came from different generations and held different roles within their community. They were united by a religious gathering. They did not leave the church alive. Their names became part of American history because of the hatred that targeted them, but their identities should not be reduced to that hatred. They were people first, members of a community before they became victims of a crime. The final question raised by Charleston is therefore not only what happened to Dylann Roof. The courts answered that question. The deeper question is what remains after the court has spoken. What remains are the names of 9 people, the survivors who lived through the attack, a community permanently connected to the tragedy, and a legal record that continues to document what happened. And beneath all of it remains the central truth established by the evidence. The massacre was not an accident, not an impulsive confrontation, and not a random act of violence. It was a planned attack against African Americans carried out inside a church by a man whose extremist racial beliefs had led him to imagine murder as a means of provoking a larger conflict. That is the legacy that Charleston leaves behind, and it is the reason the story must ultimately remain centered not on the mythology of the perpetrator, but on the people whose lives were taken and the community that survived. The legal case against Dylann Roof had reached its most severe conclusion. A federal jury had found him guilty on all 33 counts in December 2016. On January 10, 2017, the jury sentenced him to death on 18 capital counts, including 9 counts connected to interference with religious exercise resulting in death and 9 firearm counts. In 2021, a federal appeals court upheld his convictions and sentence. From a legal perspective, the path was therefore clear. Roof had been identified, arrested, prosecuted, convicted, sentenced, and later subjected to appellate review. But the meaning of the Charleston massacre cannot be contained within those dates. The case remains significant because of what happened before the shooting, what happened inside Emanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church, and what the evidence revealed about the relationship between extremist ideology, preparation, target selection, and violence. At the center of that story are 9 people who entered Mother Emanuel on June 17, 2015, expecting to participate in a Bible study. They came from different generations and held different positions within their community. Cynthia Graham Hurd was 54 and worked as a librarian. Susie Jackson was 87 and a longtime member of the church. Ethel Lance was 70 and worked at the church. Reverend DePayne Middleton Doctor was 49. Reverend Clementa Pinckney was 41, a minister and South Carolina state senator. Tawanza Sanders was 26. Reverend Daniel Simmons Sr. was 74. Sharonda Coleman Singleton was 45, a minister and teacher. Myra Thompson was 59 and a church member. Their ages stretched across more than 6 decades. Their occupations and responsibilities were different. Their individual lives were different. Yet on that evening, they were together in the same place, participating in the same religious gathering. That ordinary purpose is essential to understanding the tragedy. The victims were not assembled for a confrontation. They were not involved in an armed conflict. They were not expecting to encounter someone who intended to kill them. Roof entered the church and was accepted as a visitor. He remained with the group for more than half an hour before beginning the attack. During that period, the people inside had no reason, according to the supplied evidence, to understand that the person among them had already spent months preparing for violence. That contrast between trust and preparation is one of the most disturbing elements of the case. Roof's preparations had taken place before the victims ever knew they were targets. On April 16, 2015, he purchased the Glock .45 that he would later use in the massacre. He obtained additional ammunition and magazines. Investigators found evidence that he had practiced shooting at home. His vehicle contained a list of predominantly African-American churches in Charleston, with Emmanuel AME at the top. Telephone data showed a brief call from his home to Mother Emmanuel in February. The evidence therefore established a timeline that began well before June 17th. The attack was not simply the result of a momentary decision inside the church. It had a history. That history matters because it shows how the massacre developed from ideology into preparation and, finally, into action. Roof's white supremacist beliefs provided the ideological foundation. Prosecutors argued that he wanted to increase racial tensions and encourage what he imagined as a race war. The victims were therefore selected not because of personal conflicts with Roof, but because they were African Americans. Mother Emmanuel was selected because it was an important African American church. The location and the victims were connected by the same motive. This is what made the massacre a federal hate crime case. It was not enough to establish that 9 people had been murdered. Prosecutors also had to establish the nature of the attack and the federal interests involved. The church was a place where people were exercising their religion. The victims were African Americans. The evidence showed that Roof's racial ideology was connected to his choice of target. The federal charges consequently reflected both the religious and racial dimensions of the crime. The case also demonstrated the importance of distinguishing between what is known and what remains uncertain. The evidence surrounding Roof is extensive, but not every question has an answer. For example, telephone records established that a brief call was made from his home to Mother Emmanuel in February 2015, but the supplied evidence does not reveal what was said. Investigators found a list of African American churches with Emmanuel AME at the top, but that list should not be used to create imagined scenes of Roof researching or visiting those churches when such details are not established. Similarly, prosecutors said Roof told Joseph Carlton Meek more than a week before the shooting that he intended to attack people during a Bible study at an AME church in Charleston. Those statements were significant, and Meek later pleaded guilty to concealing a felony and making false statements. But the precise conversation should not be reconstructed beyond what the evidence establishes. In a case as heavily documented and publicly discussed as Charleston, the temptation to fill gaps with dramatic details is strong. Accuracy requires resisting that temptation. The facts are already powerful enough. The same principle applies to the 5 people who survived the shooting. Their survival is an established fact, but the supplied information does not provide detailed personal accounts of what they saw, heard, or felt. Their experiences should therefore not be invented. The absence of those details does not weaken the story. Instead, It reminds us that a responsible account must recognize the boundaries of the evidence. True crime storytelling can easily become focused on the perpetrator, particularly when the perpetrator has left behind ideological material or when the crime has attracted enormous public attention. Charleston presents a reason to resist that tendency. Rufe's ideology is necessary to understand the motive, but the ideology should not become the most important character in the story. His beliefs matter because they explain why 9 people were targeted. His preparations matter because they demonstrate intent. His actions matter because they produce the deaths. But the center of the story remains the people who were killed and the community they belong to. Their names should not disappear beneath the legal history of the man who murdered them. The aftermath also raised questions beyond Rufe himself. One of the most important concerned the firearm he had obtained before the attack. In 2021, the Department of Justice announced a settlement resolving civil lawsuits involving the federal background check system. The lawsuits included 14 plaintiffs, among them families of victims and survivors. The cases raised questions about whether the National Instant Criminal Background Check System had failed to identify information that could have prevented Rufe from obtaining the firearm. The federal government agreed to a settlement worth many millions of dollars. This part of the story is important because it demonstrates how the consequences of Charleston extended beyond criminal punishment. The criminal case asked what Rufe had done and what punishment he deserved. The civil litigation examined a different issue: whether institutional failures surrounding the firearm purchase had contributed to the circumstances that made the attack possible. These are different questions, and they should remain separate. Rufe's responsibility for the massacre was established in criminal court. The civil proceedings addressed the background check system and related claims. Together, however, they demonstrate how one act of violence can generate multiple forms of legal scrutiny. There was also the separate case involving Joseph Carlton Meek. According to prosecutors, Meek had received information about Rufe's intentions before the attack and later failed to fully report what he knew. His guilty plea in 2016 to concealing a felony and making false statements added another layer to the aftermath. Again, this did not change the central responsibility for the 9 killings. It demonstrated instead that investigators had examined the wider circumstances surrounding Rufe and the information available before and after the massacre. The Charleston case, therefore, became more than a single criminal prosecution. It became an examination of preparation, ideology, firearms background checks, federal hate crime law, religious freedom, and the responsibility of people who may possess knowledge of criminal plans. Yet none of these legal questions should obscure the simplest description of what happened. On June 17, 2015, 9 people were killed inside a church while participating in a Bible study. The gunman had selected the location because it served an African-American community. His motive was connected to white supremacist beliefs. His preparation had begun months earlier. He acquired the weapon in advance, obtained ammunition and magazines, practiced shooting, and researched potential African-American church targets. He then entered Mother Emanuel and waited among the people before opening fire. Afterward, the investigation reconstructed the path that had led to the attack. The federal prosecution established his guilt. The sentencing process imposed the death penalty. The appeals process upheld the convictions and sentence. The civil proceedings raised separate questions about the firearm background check system. Each process addressed a different part of the aftermath. None could change the fundamental loss. That is the limit of justice in a case such as Charleston. The law can identify the offender. It can establish motive. It can impose punishment. It can examine institutional failures. But it cannot restore the people who were killed. The 9 names remain more important than the sentence imposed on their killer. They represent the human cost of an ideology that transformed racial hatred into deliberate violence. Their ages, professions, and roles demonstrate that the attack did not erase a category of people. It erased individuals, and the church where they gathered was not simply a crime scene. It was a place of faith and community that had been deliberately selected as a target. The lasting significance of Charleston, therefore, lies in the connection between those facts. Extremist ideology became preparation. Preparation became target selection. Target selection became violence. Violence produced 9 deaths. And those deaths produced years of criminal and civil proceedings that could establish responsibility but could never restore what had been lost. The story ends not with the mythology of the gunman, but with the reality of the people he targeted. They had entered Mother Emanuel for Bible study. They represented generations of a community. They were welcomed into a place where faith brought people together. By the end of that evening, 9 of them were dead. The most important lesson in remembering Charleston is therefore not the image of the perpetrator or the spectacle of the crime. It is the recognition that hatred becomes most dangerous when human beings are reduced to categories, and when ideology turns those categories into targets. The evidence in this case shows how that process unfolded. It also shows why the victims must remain at the center of the story. Their lives existed before the massacre, and their lives were larger than the circumstances of their deaths. Their names remain the clearest reminder of what was lost on June 17, 2015. The story of the Charleston Church Massacre does not end with the sound of a courtroom verdict, and it does not end with the sentence imposed upon Dylan Roof. The legal record has an ending of its own. In December 2016, a federal jury found Roof guilty on all 33 federal counts. On January 10, 2017, that same jury sentenced him to death on 18 capital counts. In 2021, a federal appeals court upheld his convictions and sentence. Those decisions established his legal responsibility for the crimes. But a legal conclusion is not the same thing as the end of a human story. The people who died inside Emmanuel African Methodist Episcopal Church remain at the center of what happened. And remembering them requires looking beyond the gunman, beyond the ideology, and beyond the courtroom. On June 17, 2015, 9 people entered Mother Emanuel for a Bible study. They represented different generations and different parts of their community. Cynthia Graham Hurd was 54, a librarian. Susie Jackson was 87 and a longtime member of the church. Ethel Lance was 70 and worked at the church. Reverend DePayne Middleton Doctor was 49 and a minister. Reverend Clementa Pinckney was 41, a minister and a South Carolina state senator. Tawanza Sanders was 26, the youngest of the 9. Reverend Daniel Simmons Sr. was 74 and a minister. Sharonda Coleman Singleton was 45, a minister and teacher. Myra Thompson was 59 and a church member. 9 names, 9 different lives, 9 different histories, 9 people who happened to be together in the same church on the same evening. Their ages stretched from 26 to 87. That range alone tells us something about the community Roof attacked. There was no single generation represented inside that room. There were younger and older members, religious leaders, a public official, a librarian, a teacher, a church employee, and other members of the congregation. They were not defined by the roles that the killer assigned to them. They had lives beyond the church and identities beyond the circumstances of their deaths. Yet on that evening, Roof reduced them to one characteristic. They were African Americans. According to the federal case, that was the reason they were targeted. The selection of Mother Emanuel was therefore central to the meaning of the crime. Roof had researched churches primarily serving African American communities in Charleston. A list found in his vehicle contained such churches, with Emmanuel AME at the top. The church was a historic institution within Charleston's African American community. The attack, therefore, had both a physical target and a symbolic dimension. Roof did not simply walk into an unrelated building and encounter people by chance. The evidence showed that the church had been selected because of the community it represented. The preparation that preceded the massacre makes this even clearer. On April 16, 2015, Roof purchased the Glock .45 used in the attack. In the weeks that followed, he acquired additional ammunition and magazines. Investigators found evidence that he had practiced shooting at home. Telephone records showed a brief call from his home to Mother Emanuel in February. The list of African American churches was found in his vehicle after his arrest. These pieces of evidence formed a timeline that stretched across several months. They demonstrated preparation rather than sudden violence. But preparation alone does not explain the crime. The investigation also found evidence of Roof's white supremacist ideology. Prosecutors argued that he wanted to increase racial tensions and encourage what he imagined as a race war. His beliefs supplied the motive that connected the different pieces of preparation. The firearm was not simply a firearm. It became the instrument of an attack that had been directed toward a racial community. The church list was not simply a list of addresses. It demonstrated that African American churches had been considered as targets. The selection of Mother Emanuel was not simply a matter of convenience. It placed an African American religious community at the center of the planned violence. The federal prosecution ultimately reflected those connections. Roof was charged with 33 federal counts in July 2015. The charges included federal offenses involving hate crimes, interference with religious exercise, and firearms. In December 2016, the jury found him guilty on all 33 counts. The following month, the jury sentenced him to death on 18 capital counts. 9 of those capital counts concerned interference with religious exercise resulting in death, corresponding to the 9 people murdered inside the church. The other 9 involved firearm offenses connected to the killings. The sentence represented the maximum punishment imposed by the federal system. But even the harshest sentence has a limit. It can punish the person responsible. It cannot restore the people who were killed. It cannot return the evening of June 17th to the moment before Roof entered the church. It cannot give the 5 survivors the version of that night they should have experienced. And it cannot give families back the people whose names became part of a federal indictment. That limitation is not a weakness in the facts of the case. It is simply the reality of a crime in which human lives were permanently lost. The aftermath also extended beyond Roof's criminal prosecution. Investigators examined whether anyone had known about his plans before the attack. According to prosecutors, Roof told Joseph Carlton Meek more than a week before the massacre that he intended to shoot people during a Bible study at an AME church in Charleston. Roof allegedly said that he had been planning the attack for more than 6 months and wanted it to become a catalyst for racial conflict. In 2016, Meek pleaded guilty to concealing a felony and making false statements. His case became another part of the broader investigation into the circumstances surrounding the massacre. It did not alter the central responsibility for the 9 murders, but it demonstrated that investigators were examining what information may have existed before the attack and how people responded to that information. Another major consequence involved the firearm used by Roof. After the massacre, civil litigation raised questions about the federal background check system and whether information that could have prevented Roof from obtaining the weapon had been identified in time. In 2021, the Department of Justice announced a settlement resolving civil lawsuits involving 14 plaintiffs, including families of victims and survivors. The federal government agreed to pay many millions of dollars as part of the settlement. Again, this was a different legal question from the criminal prosecution. The criminal case established Roof's responsibility. The civil cases examined the operation of the background check system and the claims arising from the firearm purchase. Together, they demonstrate how the consequences of Charleston extended beyond a single courtroom. Yet the central fact remained unchanged throughout every stage of the investigation and litigation. 9 people were dead because Roof deliberately attacked them inside a church. The 5 people who survived carried the fact of that night into the future. The supplied evidence does not provide detailed personal accounts from those survivors, and therefore their individual experiences should not be recreated. What can be said is that their survival formed part of the permanent record of the massacre. 9 people died. 5 people survived. The church became the scene of one of the most consequential acts of racial violence in the United States in the 21st century. and the legal system spent years establishing the responsibility of the person who carried it out. The story of Charleston also demonstrates why accuracy matters in true crime. There are details that are firmly established: the date, the location, the 9 victims, the 5 survivors, the firearm purchase, the preparation, the list of churches, the telephone record, the ideological evidence, the arrest, the federal indictment, the conviction, the death sentence, the appeal, the separate case involving Meek, and the civil settlement concerning the background check system. There are also details that should remain limited to what the evidence establishes. The February telephone call, for example, is documented, but its contents are not provided. The experiences of the 5 survivors are real, but their individual thoughts and emotions should not be invented. Statements attributed to Roof through prosecutors' accounts should remain identified as statements attributed to him rather than transformed into unquestionable facts beyond the evidence. This distinction is especially important in a case involving extremist ideology. Sensationalism can accidentally give the perpetrator more importance than the victims. A responsible account should do the opposite. Roof's beliefs matter because they explain the motive. His preparations matter because they establish intent. His actions matter because they cause the deaths. But none of those facts should turn him into the protagonist of the story. The protagonists of the human story are the people who were inside Mother Emanuel, people who came together for Bible study, people who belonged to a community, people whose lives existed long before June 17, 2015. Their deaths cannot be separated from the racial hatred that targeted them, but neither should their identities be reduced to being victims of that hatred. The names must remain: Cynthia Graham Hurd, Susie Jackson, Ethel Lance, DePayne Middleton Doctor, Clementa Pinckney, Tawanza Sanders, Daniel Simmons, Sr. Sharonda Coleman Singleton, Myra Thompson. They were 9 individuals, not one statistic. Their ages covered more than 60 years. Their roles reflected different parts of a community. Their presence at Mother Emanuel reflected a shared act of faith. That is where this story should ultimately return. Before there was an indictment, there was a church. Before there was a federal trial, there was a Bible study. Before there was a death sentence, there were 9 people alive inside Mother Emanuel. And before the massacre became a case, remembered through court records and historical accounts, it was an evening in which people gathered together as they had done before. Roof entered that community carrying an ideology that prosecutors said was intended to turn racial hatred into violence and provoke a wider conflict. The evidence showed that he had prepared for months. He selected his weapon. He gathered ammunition. He practiced shooting. He researched African American churches. He placed Emanuel AME at the top of a list. Then he entered the church and was accepted into the gathering. More than half an hour later, he opened fire. 9 people died. 5 survived. The investigation began. The suspect was arrested in North Carolina the following day. The federal case followed. The jury convicted him. The jury sentenced him to death. The appeal upheld that result. Civil litigation examined the firearm background check process. Years passed, but the basic facts did not change. 9 people went into Mother Emanuel. 9 people did not leave alive. The final lesson of Charleston is therefore not about the spectacle of the crime. It is about the consequences of reducing human beings to categories and allowing racial hatred to become a justification for violence. The case shows how an ideology can be accompanied by preparation, how preparation can lead to target selection, and how target selection can culminate in irreversible loss. It also shows the limits of what justice can accomplish after the fact. Courts can determine guilt. Sentences can impose punishment. Civil proceedings can address institutional questions. Investigations can reconstruct the timeline. None of them can reverse death. What remains is memory, evidence, and the responsibility to tell the story accurately. And so the story of Charleston ends where it should have begun, with the people inside the church. They were not symbols when they entered Mother Emanuel. They were human beings. They had names, ages, occupations, responsibilities, and communities. They gathered for Bible study. They trusted the place they were in. They welcomed a visitor. And their lives were taken because that visitor had chosen them as representatives of a racial group he hated. The most enduring way to remember Charleston is not to give the killer the final word. It is to remember the 9 people whose names survived him. Their names are the part of the story that hatred could not erase.